Section 1. The show that made controversy. Its identity. There is something almost meditative about revisiting a show that never once tried to be safe. Family Guy premiered on the 31st of January 1999, right after Super Bowl 33, in a time slot that guaranteed millions of eyeballs would see it whether they wanted to or not. And those 22 million viewers who watched that first episode discovered something that evening that was hard to name at the time, a cartoon that felt like it had been smuggled into existence, like someone had left a door unlocked at the broadcasting tower, and Seth MacFarlane had quietly walked through it before anyone could stop him. The show was, from its very first moments, different. It was not The Simpsons, though you could feel the influence in the architecture of the Griffin family, the well-meaning, lovably dim father, the patient and put-together mother, the kids with their odd specific anxieties. It was not South Park, though it shared that same willingness to wade into the kind of material that makes network executives check their blood pressure. Family Guy was its own strange animal, and the most interesting thing about it was not what it was willing to show you. It was the particular way the show told stories. The rhythm. The sideways logic of a cutaway gag that could zip you from Rhode Island to a submarine in the 1940s in half a second flat. The sense that the show operated by its own internal rules and would never apologize for them. For the first few seasons, the show existed on this delicate edge between sharp and reckless. The characters were vivid and he-town in their flaws. Peter Griffin bumbling through life with the specific confidence of a man who has never once considered that he might be wrong. Lois holding the household together through a combination of patience and willpower that bordered on the heroic. Brian carrying himself with the quiet sadness of someone who knows exactly how much potential they have and exactly how little of it they've used. Stewie, in those early days, was genuinely unsettling, a baby who spoke like a Victorian villain and spent most of his waking hours designing weapons. These characters worked not because they were admirable, but because the show understood the difference between a character you root for and a character you recognize. You recognize these people. You had met versions of them. That familiarity was the engine underneath all the strangeness. And then, inevitably, the show pushed further. Family Guy has accumulated more controversy per season than almost any other animated series in the history of American television. It has been protested by religious groups and advocacy organizations, pulled from streaming services, banned in certain countries, and cited in congressional discussions about broadcast decency standards. The Parents Television Council named it the worst primetime show for family viewing not once but multiple times across different years. The Federal Communications Commission received enough formal complaints about specific episodes that the documentation ran to thousands of pages. In 2007, Venezuela banned the show from airing on local networks after an episode about marijuana legalization prompted the country's justice minister to characterize it as American propaganda promoting drug culture. None of that slowed it down. What makes Family Guy's specific brand of controversy worth examining slowly, carefully, the way you might examine something fragile, is that the controversies were rarely simple. They were rarely cases of the show just doing something cruel and thoughtless and skating away. The more interesting controversies were the ones where something genuinely complicated was happening, where the show was attempting something that it only half succeeded at, where the writers clearly had a point they were trying to make, and where the distance between their intention and their execution became the most revealing thing about them. Some of the storylines we'll be moving through tonight are things that were never meant to air in the United States at all. One of them was pulled from streaming platforms within days of a national tragedy. One of them prompted more than 100,000 people to sign an internet petition demanding that the show reverse course. Several of them were condemned by advocacy groups representing communities the show claimed it was trying to support. And somewhere inside almost all of them, buried underneath the noise and the outrage and the cultural fallout, there is something worth sitting with. A genuine question the show was asking about family, about identity, about what it means to belong to a group of people who drive you completely mad and who you would be lost without. We will take our time with all of it. So, settle in. Let the room go quiet around you. Let whatever tension you're carrying in your shoulders drop a little. We are going to move through these stories the way you move through a long night, unhurried, curious, willing to follow wherever the thing leads. Drop a comment below and tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there. I love knowing who's out there in the dark with me. And if you haven't yet, a subscription means the world. It keeps the channel going and puts more of these long-form stories in front of people who need something to fall asleep to. Section 2. The only episode that was banned in America. Partial Terms of Endearment. The 8th season of Family Guy ended with a quiet absence. Most viewers at the time didn't even notice, not at first. The season had been running along at its usual pace, 20 episodes of the Griffin family's particular brand of mayhem, with cutaways and shouting and Stewie's increasingly complicated relationship with reality. And then the season simply stopped, one episode short of where it should have been. The episode that should have closed out the 8th season was called Partial Terms of Endearment. It had been written, animated, recorded, and completed. It was ready to broadcast, and Fox made the decision not to air it in the United States at all. It has never aired on any American television network. Not on Fox, not on Adult Swim, not on any of the cable channels that run Family Guy reruns at 2 in the morning to an audience of insomniacs and college students. The episode exists, you can find it if you look. It was released straight to DVD in September of 2010, and it aired on BBC Three in the United Kingdom in June of that year, which is how any record of it being seen at all survived. But in the country where the show was made, by the network that made it, the episode was quietly and firmly set aside. The reason, which you can probably guess from the title alone if you've spent any time with the show, is abortion. Not as a background detail, not as a passing cutaway joke, as the actual central subject of the episode's story. And in the landscape of American broadcast television in 2010, that was apparently still a bridge too far, even for a show that had by that point broadcast episodes about everything from infanticide to domestic terrorism to a baby building a fully functional particle accelerator in his nursery. The episode begins at Lois Griffin's college reunion, which is one of those settings the show used periodically to remind the audience that Lois had a life before Peter, before children, before the suburbs, that there was a Lois who existed in the world before she became the family's center of gravity. At the reunion, Lois reconnects with an old friend from her college days, a woman named Naomi, and Naomi and her husband Dale have a proposal. They have been trying to have a child. They have not been able to. Naomi's body cannot carry a pregnancy to term, and she and Dale have exhausted the options available to them. What they are asking Lois to consider is acting as a surrogate, carrying a child that would be genetically theirs, implanted through in vitro fertilization, and given to them after the birth. It is a genuinely warm and sympathetic setup, and the show plays it that way. Naomi is not a villain or a joke. She is a person who wants a family and has run out of ordinary ways to build one. And Lois being the version of Lois who, underneath all the chaos of the Griffin household, genuinely believes in doing good when she can, says yes. Peter, predictably, is less enthusiastic. His objections are not philosophical. They are the objections of a man who does not fully understand the mechanics of what is being proposed and who immediately assumes it involves other people in his marriage in ways he objects to. Once he is brought up to speed on the actual medical situation, he remains reluctant, but Lois proceeds. The procedure is done. She is pregnant. And then Naomi and Dale are killed in a car accident. The scene is handled without sentimentality, which is actually one of the episode's stranger qualities. The couple is here, and then they are gone. And Lois is left holding a pregnancy that belongs to two people who no longer exist. She does not know what to do with it. Peter does not know what to do with it. The baby cannot be given to its genetic parents because its genetic parents are dead. The only choices remaining are to carry it to term and give the child up for adoption, or to terminate the pregnancy. What follows is something that feels almost uncomfortable in how straightforwardly it presents both sides of the debate. Peter, swayed by a group of anti-abortion protesters who show up outside the house with signs and an emotional pitch about the sanctity of the life growing inside Lois, shifts to the pro-life position and argues that she should carry the pregnancy to term. Lois, who began the episode as the one more eager to proceed, finds herself pulling in the opposite direction not out of cruelty, but out of a clear-eyed recognition that the situation has changed entirely. She wanted to give her friend a child. Her friend is gone. The calculus is different now. The episode is careful, in its own lurching Family Guy kind of way, to let both arguments breathe. It does not moralize. It does not arrive at a tidy lesson. Peter's pro-life position is treated with as much genuine engagement as Lois's pro-choice one, which, in the context of a Seth MacFarlane production, is somewhat remarkable, because MacFarlane himself is about as progressive a figure as you will find in mainstream entertainment. And at the end of the episode, Lois has the abortion. Peter turns to the camera, the show breaking its own fourth wall in the most direct way, and says, simply, We had the abortion. And that is how it ends. No musical resolution. No moment of consolation. Just a fact delivered to the audience and then silence. The episode was written by Danny Smith, one of the show's original writers, and it was directed by Joseph Lee. MacFarlane has said publicly that he did not agree with Fox's decision to pull the episode, and that the show was making a sincere attempt to explore both perspectives on an issue that the country was, and remains, deeply divided about. He has characterized the ban as an example of a network getting cold feet in the face of pressure that may not have materialized if the episode had simply aired. And here's the thing that makes Fox's decision genuinely puzzling when you examine it closely. The episode is not, by the standards of what Family Guy regularly broadcast, especially extreme. It is not gratuitously violent. It does not sexualize anyone. It does not mock a specific ethnic or religious group in the ways that other episodes of the show have done freely and without consequence. What it does is tell a story in which a character chooses to have an abortion, and in which that choice is presented not as a moral failure but as the outcome of a complicated, grief-soaked situation in which there are no good options left. In Britain, where the episode aired without incident, the response from viewers was largely calm. The show's British audience processed it as a piece of satire that was trying to do something earnest inside a comedic framework, and while there were discussions about how effectively it achieved that, there was no national crisis. The episode simply existed as an episode. In America, it never got the chance to exist as anything. What the ban reveals, more than anything the episode itself reveals, is the specific geography of what is and is not permissible in American broadcast culture. A cartoon can show a baby plotting to murder his mother. It can show extended sequences of graphic cartoon violence, characters being dismembered or crushed, jokes about suicide and cancer, and 9/11 and AIDS, and virtually every other subject that polite society has agreed to treat carefully. But a cartoon that portrays a woman choosing to terminate a pregnancy without judgment, without a horror movie frame around it, without treating the choice as a tragedy that is the thing that cannot air. Seth MacFarlane publicly expressed his frustration with the decision, noting that the episode never told the audience what to think. It showed two people in an impossible situation making the choice that the woman in that situation ultimately chose to make. It did not ask you to celebrate it. It asked you to understand how someone could arrive there. What is perhaps most interesting about Partial Terms of Endearment, from a purely narrative standpoint, is how it functions as a Lois episode in a way that very few Family Guy episodes do. The show, across its long run, has often treated Lois as a supporting character in her own home, the reactive presence who responds to Peter's chaos, the steady hand trying to keep the household from capsizing. Here, the camera is on her. The decision is hers. The weight of it is hers. And the show, whatever else you might say about it, takes that weight seriously. It is an imperfect episode of an imperfect show, doing its best with material that most of American entertainment would not touch at all. The fact that it was sealed away rather than aired says something about the show, but it says considerably more about the country it was made in. Number. Section 3. The Death of Brian Griffin. When a rating stunt broke the internet, on the 24th of November 2013, Family Guy killed its most beloved character, not through the slow drift of Flanderization, not through the gradual rewrites that had hollowed out Stewie's menace and pushed Peter's stupidity past the point of sympathy. Brian Griffin, the martini-drinking, novel-writing, philosophy-quoting family dog who had been at the center of the show since its very first episode, was hit by a car. He was carried to a veterinarian, and he died on the table, surrounded by a grieving Griffin family, in a scene that was played completely, utterly, without comedy. No cutaway, no twist. No one fell over or made a face. Peter held Brian as the life went out of him, and the scene sat there in its grief like a stone. Fans were stunned in a way that had not been seen since a major television death in years. The episode, the 6th episode of the 12th season, titled Life of Brian, had begun ordinarily enough. Stewie destroyed his own time machine, tired of its misuse, and the family went about their day. Peter and the kids were playing street hockey in the neighborhood when a car came around the corner at speed. Brian, chasing after a ball that had rolled into the road, was struck. The impact was sudden and shocking. The show did not linger on it grotesquely, but it did not look away either. Brian was on the pavement. He was hurt badly, and the family knew before they even got him to the hospital that this was not the kind of hurt that heals. The veterinarian told them what they already knew. Brian's injuries were too severe. There was nothing to be done. And one by one, the Griffin family said goodbye. Peter knelt beside him. Lois held Stewie's hand. Brian, in his last moments, told the family he was glad to have been part of it, that he loved them, and then he was gone. The rest of the episode dealt with the family processing the loss, and with Stewie devastated in a way that the show had rarely allowed either of them to be accepting a replacement dog named Vinny, a thick-accented Italian-American mutt voiced by Tony Sirico, who brought his own quiet warmth to the role. Twitter erupted within minutes of the episode airing. The hashtag number #BringBackBrian trended nationally within the hour. By the following morning, a petition on Change.org demanding the character's resurrection had gathered tens of thousands of signatures. Fan forums across the internet were filled with people expressing everything from genuine grief to deep, burning fury. Some viewers felt that the show had committed an act of creative vandalism, destroying something irreplaceable, something that had been a constant in American animated television for 14 years, without any apparent reason beyond the shock of it. Others were suspicious. They had watched Family Guy long enough to know that the show had a complicated relationship with consequence. The Stewie Kills Lois two-parter from Season 6 had seemed to commit to enormous change, and then revealed itself to be a simulation. Entire dramatic arcs had been undone with a shrug. The show's history was filled with moments that looked permanent until they weren't. Still, the death of Brian held. The show aired the following week's episode with Vinny as part of the household and Brian still gone. It looked, for the first time in a long time, like Family Guy was doing something it had never actually done before letting a choice stick. And then, 2 episodes after Life of Brian, on December 15th, the Christmas episode aired. Stewie, still unable to fully absorb the loss of the one being in the world who had always truly understood him, was at a shopping mall when he encountered something impossible. A past version of himself from a timeline just slightly behind the present, walked past with a functioning time machine. The two Stewies talked. The older one, who had already used the device and knew where it led, handed over the machine. And Stewie, standing at the precipice of the biggest decision of his life, went back. He saved Brian. He stepped in front of the car, physically dragged Brian out of the road, and the car passed harmlessly. Brian was alive. The timeline reasserted itself. Vinny ceased to have ever entered the picture, and Family Guy reset to factory settings, exactly as though the previous 3 weeks had never happened. Seth MacFarlane, in the aftermath, tweeted that the whole thing had been a holiday lesson about gratitude and not taking the people you love for granted. He asked the audience whether they really thought the show would kill off Brian permanently. The response from a large portion of the fan base was something that could be charitably characterized as a polite but firm expression of resentment. Because here is the thing that bothered people, and it is worth sitting with this carefully, because the resentment was not irrational. The death of Brian Griffin had not felt like a stunt while it was happening. It had felt real. The show had used every tool in its emotional arsenal to make it feel real: the lack of comedy, the restrained and careful way the death scene was shot, the rawness of Stewie's response. Viewers had allowed themselves to be moved by it. They had grieved a fictional dog with something that felt uncomfortably like genuine sadness. And then the show had said, essentially, "We appreciate the reaction, here he is back, surprise." Seth MacFarlane told reporters that the size of the fan reaction had genuinely surprised him. The production team had expected discussion. They had not expected the level of outrage that materialized. When he said in an interview that the reaction showed people still cared deeply about the character, which is true, and is actually a nice thing to discover about your audience, there was also a note of something else in his framing. A recognition that the stunt had worked exactly as intended. People had engaged, the show had trended, the internet had talked about Family Guy for weeks, in a way it had not talked about it in years. MacFarlane was quoted as saying that he never intended for Brian's death to be permanent, and that the plan all along had been the Christmas resurrection. This was disputed by some people connected to the production, who suggested that the permanence was considered at various points during development before the creative team ultimately backed away from it. The full truth of the creative process behind those weeks is probably more complicated than any single account suggests. What is not complicated is the aftermath. Brian came back, and the show moved on. And within a few episodes, Vinny had all but disappeared from the story, and Brian was exactly where he had always been at the bar, at Peter's side, working on the novel he would never finish. The death of Brian Griffin had been, ultimately, a 3-week vacation. And yet, and this is the part that tends to get overlooked in the discussion of whether the stunt was cheap, the fact that the fan response was that large is revealing in itself. It says something important about what Brian meant to people who watched the show. In the years leading up to the death episode, fan discourse about Family Guy had become increasingly critical of Brian, of the way his character had shifted from the show's grounded voice of reason into something more arrogant and self-serving, more preachy, more difficult to root for. Many people had been vocally frustrated with the direction the character had taken. And then when the show killed him, those same people lost their minds. Which suggests that what fans were angry about in those years of criticism was not Brian himself, but the distance between who Brian was in the early seasons and who he had become. The love for the character was still there. It had never gone away. It had just curdled into something that looked like resentment until the threat of permanent loss clarified what was actually underneath it. In that sense, Life of Brian and Christmas Guy together did something accidentally meaningful. They demonstrated how much emotional capital the show had built up in its early seasons, capital it was still drawing on a decade later, even as the creative decisions of the intervening years had depleted much of it. The audience's grief at Brian's death was, in part, grief for the Brian of seasons 1 through 4, grief for the voice of reason they had lost slowly over many years, mourned all at once in a 30-minute episode. The Change.org petition gathered over 100,000 signatures. It remains one of the largest fan petitions ever organized in response to a fictional character's death. Vinny, who was a genuinely warm and well-voiced creation, was almost entirely forgotten within a few weeks of Brian's return. Tony Sirico, the actor who voiced him, passed away in 2022, and his work on those brief Family Guy episodes remains a small and affectionate footnote in the record of a remarkable career. Brian Griffin is still on the show. He still drinks, he still works on the novel, he still drives Peter around and tries, with varying success, to be the adult in the room. Number. Section 4 Seahorse Seashell Party, the most uncomfortable ending in cartoon history. There is a moment in the second episode of the 10th season of Family Guy that arrives like something cold dropping into warm water. Meg Griffin has spent the better part of a decade being the family's designated target, not in the usual sitcom way, where the awkward character is the butt of 1 or 2 jokes per episode before the story moves on. In the Family Guy way, which is sustained, encyclopedic, and relentless, where entire episodes are structured around the premise that Meg's presence is a burden to the people around her, that her suffering is amusing, that her need for basic dignity is somehow an imposition. She has been farted on. She has been called ugly by her own father in terms that would be devastating coming from a stranger. She has been forgotten, excluded, physically pushed away, and told directly and without irony that the family sometimes wished she did not exist, and through all of it she has absorbed it. Because that is the role she has been assigned. Because the show has decided that Meg's function is to be the lightning rod for everything the Griffin family cannot process about themselves. And then comes Seahorse Seashell Party. The episode's setup is simple. A hurricane is approaching. The Griffins are stuck inside the house. The power is out. The mood is restless and irritable. Brian has, with fairly limited discretion, consumed a quantity of magic mushrooms and is experiencing what the show depicts as a vivid, unsettling psychedelic experience involving hallucinations of vines and stars and the universe dissolving into abstract color. It is a B plot. It is strange and occasionally funny, and it exists mostly to give Brian something to do while the real story unfolds in the living room. In the living room, the family is bored, and when the Griffin family is bored, Meg pays the price. The insults begin small, a sharp word here, a dismissive gesture there. Meg tries to redirect. She tries to participate. She is shut down, talked over, shoved aside by the familiar contempt that has become the family's default language when dealing with her. And then Meg snaps. It happens in a way that is almost quiet at first. A decision crosses her face. You can see it even in animation, in the particular stillness that settles over her before she opens her mouth. And when she does open her mouth, what comes out is not a tantrum. It is something considerably more devastating than a tantrum. It is an accounting. She turns to Chris first. She tells him exactly what he is: the brother who has never once stood beside her, who has taken every opportunity to join in on the family's treatment of her because it was easier than doing anything else, because it was comfortable and familiar. Chris is rattled immediately, not because the accusation is complex, but because it is accurate. Then she turns to Lois. This is the part of the scene that hits hardest, because Lois, despite all her failings, despite all the ways the show has slowly flattened her from a full-dimensional character into a more reactive one, is still the character most clearly positioned as the family's moral compass. And Meg removes that positioning methodically. She recounts Lois's own history, the shoplifting, the drug use, the exploits from her past that the show has occasionally referenced as backstory, and she holds them up not as accusations of hypocrisy per se, but as evidence that Lois has no standing to treat her daughter as somehow lesser. Meg tells her mother that when she turns 18, she does not know whether she wants to be around any of them ever again. Lois begins to cry. And Meg, with the momentum of someone who has been waiting years for this exact moment, keeps going. She turns to Peter last, and what she says to Peter is not particularly intricate. It does not need to be. She simply describes, with the flat precision of a witness giving testimony, who Peter Griffin has been as a father. Selfish, reckless, a man who treats his children as props in his own story rather than as people he is responsible for. A man whose behavior, if observed by someone outside the family, would be recognizable as abuse. Peter laughs. He laughs because he does not know what else to do, and because the idea that he is the villain in someone else's story does not fit the self-image he has carried undamaged for his entire adult life. Then Meg confronts him more directly. And something happens in Peter that is interesting to watch. You can see him register, for just a moment, that his daughter is telling him something true. That the laughter is a reflex, not an argument. He goes quiet. And in the absence of his usual noise, without Peter anchoring the room's emotional reality, the whole thing begins to dissolve. Without Meg as the agreed-upon target, the family has no stable arrangement. Lois turns on Peter. Peter, wounded and defensive, strikes back. Chris, whose entire sense of family hierarchy has just been upended, does not know where to stand. The room fractures. The hurricane outside feels almost metaphorical. Meg watches it happen. And then, in what the show presents as a moment of self-sacrifice and understanding, though a significant portion of the audience reads it as something else entirely, she puts it back together. She goes to Peter. She apologizes. She takes back what she said, not because she was wrong, but because she has decided that this is her role, that the family cannot function without a lightning rod, that if she is not the one absorbing the family's collective dysfunction, they will turn it on each other and everything will fall apart. Stewie, in the final scene, turns to the camera and offers a little moral about the episode's drug subplot and the inadvisability of trying psychedelics. The episode ends. The controversy around Seahorse Seashell Party is not really about what happened in the episode. It is about what the episode said that it meant. Because the episode's ending frames Meg's decision to return to the role of family scapegoat as a form of wisdom, as an act of love even. By understanding her function in the family system and choosing to fulfill it rather than upend it, Meg is presented as having achieved something like maturity. The show, in its framing of that moment, seems to be saying that recognizing your place, even if your place is a painful one, is a kind of grace. And critics of the episode, and there were many, pointed out the fairly obvious problem with that message. What the episode is describing, if you translate it out of the comedic register and into plain language, is a person in an abusive dynamic choosing to stay in that dynamic for the benefit of the people abusing them. And the show positions this choice as something admirable. The lesson embedded in Meg's decision is not, speak up and the people who love you will change. It is closer to, if you speak up, things will get worse for everyone. So your suffering is actually a service you provide to your family. Advocacy organizations focused on domestic abuse issues were fairly direct in their criticism of that message. They pointed out that the logic the episode applies to Meg's situation maps onto exactly the kind of thinking that keeps people trapped in harmful environments, the belief that leaving or resisting will cause more damage than staying and absorbing. The show would not have framed a live-action episode that way. Put the same ending in a medical drama or a crime procedural, and it reads as a horror story. Put it in an animated comedy, dress it in the language of self-discovery and family love, and it slides past without the same scrutiny. What makes the episode genuinely complicated, and this is worth acknowledging, is that the confrontation scene itself, the sequence in which Meg calls out her family, is extraordinarily well done. The writers clearly understood what they were doing in those minutes. The accusations are specific and grounded and land with real weight. Mila Kunis's performance in the role is as good as anything in the episode, and possibly as good as anything in the show's history focused on Meg. You feel the years of built-up pressure behind every word. It is the ending that undercuts all of it. The show had built to a moment of genuine clarity and then walked it back. And the walk back was framed as the lesson. Meg stood up for herself. The family fell apart, and the conclusion drawn was that standing up for yourself was the wrong move. Fans of the show often rank Seahorse Seashell Party among the most frustrating episodes ever made, not because it is bad, but because it is very close to good and then deliberately chooses not to be. The confrontation scene is the best Meg has ever been treated. And the ending is the worst lesson the show has ever taught about why people stay in situations that hurt them. Number. Section 5 screams of silence. When Family Guy tried to get serious about domestic violence. The third episode of the 10th season of Family Guy begins with Quagmire nearly dying during a session of autoerotic asphyxiation. This is established in the first few minutes, played for the kind of absurdist shock that the show has always reached for when it needs to establish that it is willing to go places other shows won't. His sister Brenda comes to take care of him, and the episode shifts. What follows is one of the most unusual and most debated 30 minutes in the show's history, an episode that attempted, with genuine sincerity, to dramatize domestic abuse in a way that was meant to be taken seriously, and that ultimately revealed more about the show's limitations than its ambitions. Brenda Quagmire, voiced by Caitlin Olsen of It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia fame, is introduced with bruises. Her boyfriend Jeff is the kind of character who functions as a symbol rather than a person. He exists at a remove from ordinary human psychology, less a human being with a comprehensible inner life than a vessel for the idea of violence. When he is on screen, other characters try to remove themselves from his vicinity. When he is alone with Brenda, the episode does not shy away from showing the audience what happens. This is where things get complicated. Family Guy, from its very first season, had been a show that operated on a principle of tonal fluidity. It could be sentimental one moment and savage the next. It could treat a subject with genuine warmth in one episode and use that same subject as the backdrop for a throwaway gag in the next. The show's relationship with tonal consistency was always approximate. It acknowledged emotion and then moved on. It acknowledged consequence and then reset. Screams of Silence could not do that. Domestic violence, handled seriously, does not allow for the usual escape valves. You cannot cut away to a joke and then cut back and pretend the bruises are still funny. The subject itself resists the show's natural inclination toward comic deflection. And, to the episode's credit, and this is real credit, it largely does not try to deflect. The abuse is shown with an earnestness that sits very uncomfortably next to the Glenn Quagmire, who, in the very same episode's opening minutes, we see almost die in a joke about sexual asphyxiation. The story follows Glenn, Peter, and Joe as they watch Brenda remain with Jeff despite every intervention they attempt. They try talking to her. They try confronting Jeff. They try staging what functions as a kind of informal intervention. And in that scene, Glenn delivers a letter to his sister, a heartfelt, carefully written piece of television in which Seth MacFarlane voices a character in a moment of genuine tenderness, telling a woman he loves that he sees her and is afraid for her. The letter does not work. Brenda stays. And the three men, having exhausted every method available to them that does not involve violence, decide to murder Jeff. Which they do. Glenn kills him in the woods. Jeff dies. And the episode ends with the suggestion that Brenda is now free, although it is careful enough not to show her celebrating. The reception from critics and advocacy groups was complicated, and the complications were real ones. The National Organization for Women and various domestic violence organizations that weighed in on the episode pointed out something important. The episode's treatment of Brenda is not actually sympathetic in the way that the episode seems to believe it is. The script explains her continued presence in the abusive relationship, primarily through her apparent inability to leave. She is portrayed as so psychologically overwhelmed by Jeff that she cannot see her own situation clearly. But the episode never actually engages with the reasons that people stay in abusive relationships, which are varied and often understandable, and are not reducible to simple incapacity. Real survivors of domestic abuse have written extensively about the ways in which the episode's portrayal rang false. The complicated tangle of love and fear and financial dependency and genuine uncertainty about whether the situation will improve, none of that is present in Brenda. She is rendered less as a person navigating an impossible situation and more as a symbol of victimhood, which is a different thing entirely and considerably less useful. The solution the episode offers male friends murdering the abuser is, it barely needs saying, not a model that translates to the real world. It is the solution of a story that has run out of other options and needed a conclusion that felt satisfying in the moment. It provides catharsis without resolution. Jeff is dead. Brenda is free. But the episode does not follow her past that freedom into whatever comes next, because whatever comes next is not a comedic story's business. Critics at the AV Club gave the episode a failing grade, arguing that a serious episode of Family Guy does not work because the show does not have the infrastructure to carry that kind of weight. The house is built for something else. Its foundations are not designed to hold a story that asks you to feel without also laughing. There is something worth sitting with in that criticism, because it is not just about this episode. It is about the structural limitation of what the show is. Family Guy has always been at its best when it allows the comedy and the feeling to exist simultaneously, when the joke and the heartbreak are the same thing, or at least are moving in the same direction at the same moment. The early Stewie and Brian episodes had that quality. Even some of the best Peter episodes in the early seasons had it. Screams of Silence tries to have feeling without the comedy, and it cannot quite sustain the attempt. The episode is not dishonest. It is not mean-spirited. By the standards of what Family Guy was doing around that period, it is actually one of the more earnest efforts the show made. But earnestness is not the same as clarity, and the episode's earnestness keeps colliding with the show's own history and its own habits and its own inability to fully commit to a register it was not built for. The detail that became something like a footnote but that deserves more attention. Brenda was never seen again in the show's regular continuity after this episode. In Season 18, a crossover episode featuring characters who had died revealed that Brenda was among the dead, which means that at some point between her rescue from Jeff and the present day of the show, she died. The episode does not explain how. The implication, for those who read it closely, is that freedom from one abusive situation did not mean freedom from the broader pattern. That without sustained support she may have ended up in another dangerous situation, or that the damage left by years of abuse had other long-term consequences. If that implication was intentional, it is one of the quietly darkest things the show has ever done. If it was careless, it is characteristic of a show that sometimes makes profound statements by accident while reaching for something much smaller. Caitlin Olsen's performance, for what it is worth, is excellent throughout. She brings a fragility and a specificity to Brenda that the script does not always earn but that she provides anyway. It is the kind of performance that makes you wish the episode had been written for a different show, one with more room for the kind of story she was trying to tell with her voice. Number. Section 6, Turban Cowboy. The episode that got pulled after a real tragedy. Family Guy has always lived with some degree of tension between the speed at which it writes jokes and the speed at which the world changes around them. A show that broadcasts 22 episodes per year, written months in advance, is always going to find itself occasionally outrun by events. A joke that was simply edgy when it was written becomes something else entirely when it is framed by a real tragedy. Most of the time, the show manages this through the same kind of aggressive self-awareness that it applies to most things, acknowledging the tension, commenting on it, using the discomfort as material. But the 11th season episode Turban Cowboy, which aired on the 17th of March 2013, did not have the opportunity to manage the tension at all. The episode had aired weeks before in the ordinary course of the television season. It had drawn its reviews, mostly negative, from critics who found its central premise, Peter befriending a Muslim man who turns out to be planning a terrorist attack, to be a combination of outdated Muslim stereotyping and plot logic that would have felt lazy even 10 years earlier. The AV Club gave it a D, which is a grade that represents not merely a bad episode but an episode that the reviewer found genuinely indefensible. The criticism centered on the episode's central message, which, despite a B-plot in which Brian criticizes Joe and Peter for their suspicion of their new friend, ultimately vindicates their suspicion. The Muslim character is a terrorist. Brian's argument against profiling is undercut by the episode's own story. There was also, in the episode, a cutaway gag. It was brief. It involved Peter in a car at the Boston Marathon, running over participants in the race. It was the kind of dark, violent joke that the show had been deploying for years, shock comedy with no particular purpose beyond the shock. When it aired in March, it was simply another example of the show going somewhere unpleasant for no especially good reason. Then, on the 15th of April, 2013, two pressure cooker bombs detonated near the finish line of the Boston Marathon. 3 people were killed. More than 260 were injured. The attack was carried out by 2 brothers, Dzhokhar and Tamerlan Tsarnaev, who had planned and executed an act of terrorism at one of Boston's most beloved annual events. Within days, a clip began circulating online. It had been edited together from 2 separate scenes in the Turban Cowboy episode, the car scene at the marathon, combined with a different scene showing Peter using a cell phone to trigger an explosion. The editing made it appear as though Peter Griffin had committed the Boston Marathon bombing. The clip spread rapidly. People shared it without context, some in confusion and some with the specific intent of generating outrage. Fox moved immediately. The episode was pulled from Fox's own website and from Hulu. The network issued statements clarifying that the circulated clip was a doctored combination of unrelated scenes. Seth MacFarlane, on Twitter, called the edited clip abhorrent and expressed his sympathy for the victims of the bombing. He was unambiguous that the clip did not reflect the episode as it aired and that he found its circulation in the context of the tragedy to be reprehensible. The clarity of MacFarlane's public response mattered. The edited clip had been spreading in a way that suggested Family Guy had somehow anticipated or referenced the bombing, which was factually false. The show had aired a fictional joke about a character running over marathon participants tasteless, certainly, and now deeply unfortunate in its timing. But it had not depicted a bomb attack, and the juxtaposition in the viral clip was entirely manufactured. Still, the episode remained off streaming platforms. Fox did not return it to Hulu for several years, and even after it was eventually restored, it remained unavailable on many services. The episode has a complicated relationship with accessibility. It is on DVD, and it has been carried by certain platforms in markets outside the United States. But, for American viewers wanting to stream new content, it occupied a kind of limbo for a sustained period. What the controversy around Turban Cowboy illuminates, beyond the particular incident that amplified it, is a problem that the show had been developing for years. The episode itself before the bombing, before the viral clip, just the episode as it aired in March had been criticized as lazy and Islamophobic. Its central joke required a Muslim character to actually be a terrorist, which meant that the episode's nominal gesture toward criticizing profiling was undone by its own plot. To make Brian's critique valid, the show would have had to let Mahmoud simply be a human being. Instead, it needed him to be guilty, because the comedy the show was reaching for required the guilty twist. This is the kind of thing that gets called punching down in the vocabulary of contemporary comedy criticism. And the phrase is worth unpacking briefly. Punching down means using the structural power of a comedy platform to mock groups that already bear a disproportionate burden of social suspicion and cultural marginalization. A Muslim terrorist character in 2013 American television was not a bold satirical choice. It was a familiar one. The joke had been made hundreds of times, and Family Guy's version of it offered nothing new, no insight, no subversion, no angle that made the familiar premise do any fresh work. The bombing made the episode impossible to discuss on its own terms for a long time. The trauma of what happened in Boston was too immediate, too specific, too human to allow for any kind of cool analytical distance. The episode became the Boston Marathon episode, and whatever else it might have been before April 15th stopped mattering. There is a separate and smaller piece of the Turban Cowboy story that sometimes gets overlooked. MacFarlane himself had narrowly missed being on American Airlines Flight 11 on the 11th of September 2001, one of the planes that struck the World Trade Center, because he was late to the airport. His response to the Boston Marathon bombing was not the response of someone indifferent to terrorism and its consequences. And yet the show he created had made a joke about the Boston Marathon months before the bombing occurred, and that joke became, through a combination of coincidence and deliberate malice on the part of whoever assembled the viral clip, something that looked for a brief and damaging moment like something else entirely. The episode has not aged gracefully. Viewed now, it reads as an artifact of a period in which the show had largely abandoned the intelligence of its early satire in favor of the comfort of familiar targets. Its Muslim character is not a person, he is a plot function. And the show's inability to see that distinction, to understand that giving a character, a religion, and a name is not the same as giving them interiority, is the failure at the heart of an episode that circumstance made. famous for all the wrong reasons. Number Section 7, Brian and Stewie in the Bank Vault, the episode that changed everything about what the show could be. The 150th episode of Family Guy aired on the 2nd of May 2010, and it was unlike anything the show had ever done. No cutaway gags, not a single one. No music past the opening theme. No characters beyond Brian and Stewie. No subplots. No third-act resolutions involving the broader family. Just two characters, a locked room, and 30 minutes of conversation. The episode was titled Brian and Stewie, and it was written by Gary Janetti, who was also the creator of the show-within-a-show mockery of British culture Downton Abbey, and whose work on this particular episode represents one of the cleanest departures from formula in the history of animation. The setup is minimal. Brian is at the bank, going through his safety deposit box. Stewie has accompanied him, which feels ordinary enough until the vault door swings shut and locks them inside. There is no dramatic trigger for what follows. No villain, no external threat. Just two characters who know each other extremely well, trapped in a sealed room with nowhere to go and nothing to do except exist in each other's company. The episode's first act is genuinely funny in the most uncomfortable possible way. Stewie has soiled his diaper when the vault door closed, a stress response that the show depicts with frank specificity, and the question of what to do about this cannot be postponed indefinitely. The solution the episode arrives at, and the specific visual gag it commits to, is one that several critics described as nausea-inducing in their reviews. It is the kind of humor that the show often reached for in its later years, the gross-out joke pushed to an extreme, but in this episode, it functions differently from the way it usually does. It functions as a necessary embarrassment, a moment in which both characters are stripped of the usual dignity that allows them to maintain a safe emotional distance from each other. Something real begins to happen after that. The middle of the episode is a conversation that keeps finding its way back to a gun. Brian has a gun in his safety deposit box. It is a revolver. Stewie notices it early and asks about it, and Brian deflects. But as the hours pass and the conversation becomes more honest, as the accumulated weight of proximity and mutual vulnerability does what it does to the people it surrounds, the deflection runs out. Brian has the gun because he has thought about ending his life. Not as a passing dark thought, not as hyperbole. He has thought about it seriously enough to make a specific plan for it, to keep a specific implement for it, to carry it forward with him from one year to the next as a kind of option. His life, he tells Stewie, sometimes feels too much. He does not know what he is for. He writes but never finishes anything. He loves people who do not love him back, or who cannot love him back in the ways he needs. He fills the time with scotch and company and the appearance of purpose. But the gun is there because he has imagined using it, and he has never quite managed to make himself get rid of it. The show handles this revelation without melodrama, which is one of the bravest choices in the episode. Brian does not collapse into sobs. He does not deliver a speech about his inner darkness. He simply admits to it, in the flat and slightly ashamed way that real people often admit to the things they have been carrying quietly, and then he sits with the admission. Stewie's response is the episode's emotional climax, and it is earned in a way that very little in the show's surrounding seasons earned anything. Stewie tells Brian that he cannot use the gun. Not because life is precious in some abstract philosophical sense, not because it would be wrong, but because Stewie would be devastated. Because Brian is the only person in the world, the only one, of all the billions of humans and animals that exist who genuinely understands Stewie, who can talk to him, who takes him seriously. Who sees him as something other than a baby to be fed and changed and put to sleep? Brian is necessary not because of any great accomplishment or any profound virtue, but because of his specific place in one specific relationship. He is necessary because there is one being in the world who would be fundamentally diminished without him. It is a simple argument. It is also, in the moment the episode arrives at it, completely devastating. The show's regular critics were largely effusive about Brian and Stewie. The AV Club gave it an A. Critics who had spent years writing about the show's decline found in this episode evidence that the writers could still do something genuinely surprising that the show was capable, when it chose to be, of abandoning its own formula and going somewhere that the formula could not have reached. The episode also generated some controversy, though of a quieter kind than the show's most explosive installments. Mental health organizations and critics writing from that perspective noted that the portrayal of suicidal ideation, while not treated sensationally, raised questions about how entertainment media handles the subject in general. These were thoughtful engagements rather than denunciations, and they pointed to the genuine care the episode was taking, while also noting that the subject required that kind of care. Producer Cara Vallo, in an interview with Forbes, explained that the episode's creation was directly inspired by the All in the Family episode Archie in the Cellar, which trapped a character in a basement with a bottle of vodka and let the resulting conversation do whatever it needed to do. Seth MacFarlane and Vallo had both been fans of that episode and saw in its premise a structural opportunity, a way to strip the show down to its most essential relationship and see what was actually there. What was there, it turned out, was something worth protecting. Brian and Stewie's friendship, by the time Brian and Stewie aired, had been one of the show's central dynamics for several seasons. But it had been carried primarily through adventure and comedy the Road to episodes, the elaborate schemes and misadventures. Those were good. This was different. This was what the friendship looked like without the plot, without the movement, without anywhere to run. It looked like two beings who needed each other in ways they had not previously acknowledged out loud. It looked like loneliness and companionship existing in the same space. It looked like Family Guy at its most human, which is a strange thing to say about a show featuring a talking dog and a baby who builds time machines, but there it is. The episode stands, to this day, as the clearest evidence that the show had capabilities it did not use often enough. Not just the ability to be funny, though it was often that, the ability to be true. Number, Section 8, The 2000-Year-Old Virgin, Family Guy's religion problem and the Jesus episode. There is a particular kind of provocation that animated comedy has always been comfortable with that live-action entertainment usually sidesteps, and that is the depiction of religious figures in contexts that their adherents would find deeply disrespectful. The Simpsons did it, carefully and often with genuine affection for the religious traditions it was poking. South Park did it with gleeful aggression and a philosophical framework, however chaotic, that at least suggested the creators had thought about what they were doing. Family Guy has done it repeatedly across its run, with varying degrees of care and varying consequences. The most sustained and most discussed example is the season 13 episode, The 2000-Year-Old Virgin, in which Jesus Christ arrives in the Griffin's neighborhood and is revealed to be, after 2,000 years, still a virgin. He has never had sex. He is lonely. He is living in a small apartment in a state of mild depression, working what amounts to a soul-crushing retail job, watching other people celebrate the holiday season that bears his name while he sits alone. It is, when you describe it plainly, one of the more audacious premises the show has ever committed to. Jesus as a sad bachelor in his 30s, rattling around a damp apartment, unlucky in love. Peter, in the episode's central arc, decides to help Jesus get laid. This is treated with the same breezy matter-of-factness that the show applies to most of Peter's schemes, as a challenge to be solved rather than as a theological crisis. Peter marshals his usual group of friends and advisors, and they set about trying to introduce Jesus to women who might be interested. The episode generated predictable controversy from Christian groups, primarily the Parents Television Council, QUIC, which had been citing Family Guy as one of the worst shows on television for family viewing for years at that point, and which was not about to let a Jesus as romantic comedy protagonist episode pass without comment. The council's criticism was direct. The episode mocked the central figure of the Christian faith in a way that would be commercially and culturally unacceptable if applied to the central figure of any other major religion. This is a criticism worth taking seriously, because it identifies something real about how American entertainment has approached religious mockery. Comedy that targets Christianity, and specifically Catholic and Protestant Christianity, the majority traditions in the United States, has always occupied a different cultural space than comedy targeting Islam, Judaism, or other religions that carry the weight of being minority faiths in the country. Family Guy has been willing to go after all of these. But the willingness to mock Jesus specifically, and to do so repeatedly and without apology, sits in a different context than mockery aimed at figures whose communities have less cultural power. MacFarlane's position on religion, which he has expressed openly across many interviews over the years, is that of a committed atheist who views organized religion critically. This position informs the show's treatment of religious material in ways that are sometimes illuminating and sometimes just dismissive. The difference, in any given episode, depends on whether the writing is working towards something. The 2000-Year-Old Virgin works, in patches, because the premise is genuinely original. The idea of Jesus as a lonely, isolated figure surrounded by the enormous cultural apparatus of Christmas, the celebration of his birth, while having no one to spend it with, has a melancholy to it that is almost touching. There is something in the image that catches at you even while the show is being crass about it. The loneliness of being the center of an enormous story that has moved beyond you and is now carried by other people, celebrated in forms that have little to do with you as a specific person with specific needs and specific feelings. The episode does not sustain that emotional note because it is not fundamentally an emotional episode. It is a comedy, and the comedy eventually takes over, and the Jesus of the final act is less a poignant figure than a straight man for Peter's chaos. But the premise held something real for a few scenes in the middle, and those scenes are why the episode is remembered as something more than just another transgression. The show's treatment of other religious figures and traditions deserves mention in this context as well, because the 2000-year-old virgin did not exist in isolation. Family Guy has, across its run, made jokes about Islam, Judaism, Mormonism, Scientology, and virtually every other organized faith with sufficient cultural visibility to have been noticed by the show's writers. Some of those jokes were more successful than others. The When You Wish Upon a Weinstein episode, which we will come to shortly, generated considerable controversy, specifically because its treatment of Jewish characters straddled an uncomfortable line between affectionate satire and the kind of broad stereotype humor that reproduces prejudice rather than examining it. The broader pattern is one of a show that treats religion primarily as material as content to be processed through the comedy machine and turned into jokes. This is not inherently wrong, and it is arguably a tradition as old as comedy itself, but it requires a precision and a self-awareness that the show has not always had. The early seasons of Family Guy were often better at this than the later ones, because the writing was sharper and because the show was still testing the limits of what it could do, rather than operating on institutional autopilot. By season 13, the machine was producing episodes at a volume and a pace that did not always allow for the kind of careful thought that the most sensitive material requires. The Jesus episode got by on the strength of its central premise and on the goodwill that strong premises generate even when their execution is imperfect. The Christian community's anger was predictable and has its own logic. But the episode, watched without that framing, is a fairly gentle piece of work. It is not vicious about Jesus. It is not contemptuous. It is mostly just sad, in a way that feels almost affectionate, the joke of a creator who has a complicated relationship with the religion of his own background, finding a way to portray its central figure as a person rather than a symbol, and discovering in that portrayal a kind of sympathy he did not necessarily expect. That does not make the episode above criticism, but it does make it something other than what the Parents Television Council was describing when they named it one of the worst things on television. Number. Section 9. Quagmire's Dad. The episode that tried to be sympathetic and broke all the dishes. Seth MacFarlane said, in an interview with LGBT media website AfterElton.com in January of 2010, that the transgender episode of Family Guy that would air later that year would be, and these were his words, probably the most sympathetic portrayal of a transsexual character that has ever been on television, dare I say. The episode aired in May of 2010. The Gay and Lesbian Alliance Against Defamation, which had been cited by MacFarlane himself as one of the organizations whose approval he hoped to earn, called it incredibly offensive to transgender people. That is quite a gap. Quagmire's Dad is the 18th episode of the 8th season, and its premise is one that the show was uniquely positioned to handle with some complexity. Glenn Quagmire, the perpetual bachelor, the neighbor who has built an entire identity around a very specific and often troubling relationship with women, discovers that his father, a Vietnam veteran he has always admired, has been living for decades with the knowledge that she is a woman trapped in a man's body. Dan Quagmire has made the decision to have gender-affirming surgery, and she has come to tell Glenn before it happens. The episode renames Dan as Ida Davis after her transition, and the central arc follows Quagmire's process of coming to terms with this revelation. He is not accepting at first his identity has been shaped partly by his father's image, and learning that image was not what he thought it was, produces a disorientation that the episode plays with both compassion and comedy. By the episode's end, Quagmire reaches a place of acceptance, telling Ida that regardless of how difficult this has been for him, she is still the person who raised him and that he loves her. That is genuinely touching. MacFarlane has said in subsequent interviews that the scene between Quagmire and Ida is the heart of what he intended the episode to be, a portrayal of a father and child relationship surviving a seismic revelation through love that is greater than confusion. And in isolation, that scene works. It is quiet and careful and earned. The surrounding episode is a different matter. Brian Griffin, who has been at a seminar out of town during Ida's initial visit, returns to find an attractive woman in the Griffin living room. He flirts, he pursues. He and Ida go out. They spend the night together. And in the morning, Quagmire informs Brian of who Ida is. What follows is 30 seconds of Brian vomiting. Not a brief, comic expression of surprise. 30 consecutive seconds of a character retching and gagging, an invisible agony at the revelation that he has slept with a transgender woman. The joke is sustained and specific, and makes absolutely clear that the show regards Brian's reaction as both understandable and funny. GLAAD was precise in their objection. The vomiting sequence communicated something clear to the audience, that the discovery of having been intimate with a transgender person is so horrifying that it produces a physical, uncontrollable, extended bodily reaction. This is not satire of transphobia. It is presentation of transphobia as a reasonable response. The audience is invited to find Brian's disgust funny, which means the audience is invited to share in it, which means the episode ends up reinforcing exactly the kind of reaction it was nominally trying to critique. The episode then adds Brian comparing Ida to a sex offender not as a line that is condemned by other characters or called out as wrong, but as a line that simply exists in the dialogue and moves forward. And then Quagmire beats Brian up. This is presented, in the episode's emotional logic, as correct as Quagmire defending his parents' dignity against Brian's transphobia, which is the right instinct and which is a satisfying moment. But it exists in an episode that has spent the preceding minutes inviting the audience to laugh at the exact behavior Quagmire is now punishing. MacFarlane's subsequent defense of the episode has centered on the argument that its intent was sympathetic and that Quagmire's storyline, his growth from shock to acceptance, represents the show's actual position. He has said he would not make major changes if he could go back. Writers for queer publications were less charitable. The problem, as they identified it, was not the existence of the episode but the specific tools it used. You can write about a character's initial discomfort with a parent's transition and have that discomfort be part of the story's honest engagement with how difficult these revelations can be for people who love them. That is legitimate and real. But the Brian subplot is not about discomfort with a parent's transition. It is about disgust at having been intimate with a transgender woman, and the extended vomiting sequence treats that disgust as comedy rather than as something to examine. The ambiguity in the episode, which GLAAD identified as one of its central failures, is the uncertainty about who the joke is on. Is the audience laughing at Brian's transphobia, understanding it to be a flaw? Or is the audience laughing with Brian's transphobia, sharing in the revulsion? The episode does not make this clear. And given that the show was not, in 2010, broadcasting to an audience that could be assumed to understand the social context of transgender experience, in the same way that audiences have been educated by subsequent years of cultural discussion, that ambiguity had real consequences. The Parents Television Council, meanwhile, complained about the episode from the opposite direction, objecting to the presence of a transgender character and the show's treatment of gender reassignment surgery at all. The PTC's objection and GLAAD's objection were thus mirror images of each other, two organizations reading the same episode as offensive for opposite reasons. The PTC thought the show was too accepting of a transgender character. GLAAD thought the show was not nearly accepting enough. MacFarlane has noted this contradictory reception as evidence that the show was doing something right, that an episode that offended both sides of the debate was probably engaging with the material honestly. This is a reasonable position to take, and it has its own logic. But it also functions as a way of dismissing both sets of criticisms, which is a slightly less honest move. Ida Davis was not a one-time character. She returned in later episodes of Family Guy, and her treatment in those appearances was similarly uneven, sometimes warm, sometimes the butt of jokes that relied on the same transphobic mechanisms as the original episode. The show's relationship with the character, across all of her appearances, reflects the same fundamental ambiguity that defined her introduction. She was, and this is genuinely significant, one of the first major recurring transgender characters in American primetime animation. That matters. The landscape of what was available for representation in 2010 was considerably narrower than it is now, and Family Guy's willingness to put the story on screen at all was meaningful, even if the execution was flawed in ways that were consequential. The intention was good. The craft was insufficient for the intention, and the gap between those two things is where the conversation about the episode has lived ever since. Number. Section 10 Road to Germany. Finding comedy in the Holocaust. The Road to episodes of Family Guy occupy a special place in the show's history. Beginning with Road to Rhode Island in the second season, the conceit Brian and Stewie traveling to some improbable location together, borrowing the structure of the old Bob Hope and Bing Crosby road pictures, produced some of the show's most beloved and most adventurous half-hours. Road to Europe, Road to Rupert, Road to the North Pole. Each one used the specific dynamic of the two characters, Brian's dry adult world weariness, Stewie's brilliant and sometimes terrifying childishness, to do something that the regular episodes could not. Road to Germany, which aired in the sixth season, is the most disturbing of the lot, and arguably the most interesting. The episode begins with a toilet. Mort Goldman, the Jewish pharmacist who appears occasionally in the show's supporting cast, uses a time machine that Stewie has left in the men's room at the bar, and is accidentally transported to 1939 Germany, 1 week before the German invasion of Poland, and 1 week, therefore, before the beginning of the Second World War. Brian and Stewie follow him, using a spare time machine component, and the episode becomes what it was always going to become. 3 characters, one of whom is Jewish, trapped in Nazi Germany. This is audacious. The word is not strong enough, but it is the right one. Setting an episode of a broad American animated comedy in the Holocaust, not in the stylized, abstracted geography of evil that some entertainment uses as a shorthand, but in the specific historical atrocity of Nazi Germany as it actually existed and functioned, is a decision that requires either tremendous courage or tremendous recklessness, and Road to Germany threads the needle in a way that is, episode by episode, more impressive than it should be. The episode does not treat the Holocaust as an abstraction. The presence of Jewish characters in 1939 Germany is treated with a weight that the show does not usually carry. Mort's terror is real and specific. The danger he is in is not theoretical. When he and Brian and Stewie encounter German soldiers, the stakes feel different from the usual Family Guy stakes because the historical context gives them a gravity that cartoon peril does not usually have. The comedy in the episode comes from the contrast between Stewie's imperious matter-of-factness and the enormity of what he is navigating, and from Brian's usual quiet exasperation elevated to genuine anxiety by circumstances beyond anything he usually encounters. There is also a sequence involving the 3 characters posing as German soldiers that mines the absurdity of the situation, without losing sight of the fact that what is being parodied is a machinery of genocide. Jewish organizations had mixed responses to the episode. Some critics from within the Jewish community appreciated the episode's willingness to engage with the Holocaust at all, to treat it as historical reality rather than a subject too weighty to touch. Others were uncomfortable with the use of the Holocaust as the backdrop for comedy, regardless of how careful the comedy was being. The debate echoed a much longer conversation in Jewish culture about Mel Brooks's work about whether finding humor inside the machinery of the Shoah is a form of defiance, or whether it risks normalizing something that should remain unassimilable. The episode's defenders often point to Mel Brooks explicitly. Brooks has written and spoken extensively about his belief that comedy can be a weapon against fascism, that making Hitler ridiculous, making the structures of Nazi power available to be laughed at, is a form of resistance. The producers rests on this argument. Road to Germany seems to be working from the same philosophical position, though with considerably less artistry than Brooks brings to the subject. What the episode does well is keep Mort Goldman at the center of the emotional stakes. He is scared. He is out of his depth. He is confronting, in real time, the machinery that was designed to kill him and everyone like him. And the show does not flinch from the reality of that confrontation even while finding comedy in the mechanics of the escape. It is a balance that most episodes of Family Guy in this era could not have sustained. Road to Germany sustains it, imperfectly but genuinely. The episode was controversial enough to generate significant media attention when it aired, and the attention was divided much as the response always is when comedy enters this territory. The Holocaust is the subject above all subjects for which the rules of satire are most contested, where the question of who has standing to make jokes is most hotly debated, and where the difference between brave and reckless is most difficult to locate from the outside. What can be said with confidence is that Road to Germany was not lazy. Whatever else you think of its choices, the episode took the subject seriously enough to put real historical specificity around the comedy. It knew where it was. It knew what it was standing in, and that awareness, sustained across the episode's runtime, is what separates it from a show that merely uses the Holocaust as a setting for shock value. Number. Section 11. When You Wish Upon a Weinstein. The first episode Fox refused to air. Before Partial Terms of Endearment, before Turban Cowboy, before any of the episodes that generated the headlines and the petitions and the advocacy group responses, there was When You Wish Upon a Weinstein. It is, historically speaking, the first Family Guy episode to be banned by Fox. It was completed during the third season, one of the original run seasons, before the cancellation, before the revival, in the period that most fans now point to as the show's golden era. And yet Fox would not air it. The episode aired eventually, not on Fox, but on Cartoon Network's Adult Swim block, and it was included in the Season 3 DVD release. By the time most people saw it, it had been building a reputation as the episode that had been too much for the network. The subject of the episode is Peter Griffin's finances, which is a more innocent starting point than the controversy would suggest. Peter has once again made a financial disaster out of the family's money, a series of spectacularly bad decisions that have drained whatever modest savings the Griffins had accumulated. Watching his misfortune, Peter begins to feel a particular kind of envy for what he perceives as Jewish people's relationship with financial wisdom and business acumen. He has convinced himself, through the kind of logic that Peter Griffin applies to most things, a mixture of laziness and pop-cultural half-knowledge, that Jewish people are inherently better at money. He wishes he had a Jewish friend who could help him sort things out. The episode then does something that the controversy around it often obscures. It gives Peter a Jewish friend, Max Weinstein, and allows the friendship to function as a genuine corrective to Peter's stereotyping. Max is a specific person with specific qualities. He is not the embodiment of any stereotype. He is a human being who happens to be Jewish and who is kind to Peter and eventually helpful to him. And by the end of the episode, Peter has learned, in the way that sitcom characters learn things imperfectly, without great depth, but with some genuine movement, that his assumption was wrong. The episode also has a B-plot involving Peter's attempt to have Chris bar mitzvahed, despite the family's Catholicism, because Peter has decided that the bar mitzvah itself is the mechanism by which Jewish people become financially competent. This is played as comedy, and the comedy makes clear that Peter's reasoning is ridiculous. Fox's objection to the episode was not precisely documented in the way that some other network decisions have been. What circulated at the time was the understanding that the network was concerned that the episode's use of Jewish stereotypes, however much the narrative ultimately undercut them, was too risky to broadcast in the current climate. The decision was made before anyone had a chance to see how audiences would respond. The Adult Swim broadcast, which came later, did not produce the firestorm that Fox had apparently anticipated. Jewish advocacy organizations, when they weighed in, were largely divided. Some found the episode offensive, citing the stereotypes that formed Peter's premise even while acknowledging that the episode eventually moved away from them. Others found it relatively benign, a cartoon idiot's misconception corrected through friendship and genuine human connection. Rabbi Daniel Lapin, writing about the episode, argued that the show's portrayal of Jewish people as financially adept was not inherently offensive because it was rooted in a genuine cultural reality that certain qualities associated with Jewish intellectual and business culture had historical roots and were not simply fabrications. This is a position that many Jewish commentators found uncomfortable, and the debate that followed was the kind that does not resolve neatly because it touches on the complicated question of when stereotypes reflect genuine cultural patterns and when they function as prejudice regardless of their origins. What the When You Wish Upon a Weinstein controversy illustrates, set alongside the Partial Terms of Endearment ban, is that Fox's decisions about what to air were not governed by a consistent principle. The network banned When You Wish Upon a Weinstein out of concern about Jewish stereotypes, and then later banned Partial Terms of Endearment out of concern about abortion. These are entirely different kinds of concerns, operating on entirely different logics. What they share is an anxiety about audience reaction that is, at its core, an anxiety about advertiser comfort. Networks make decisions about content with one eye always on the companies that pay for the airtime around the content. An episode that might generate a boycott of a major advertiser is a different kind of risk than an episode that generates editorial criticism in the press. The calculus is commercial before it is moral, and the decisions look arbitrary from the outside because they are responding to business considerations that are not visible from the outside. Seth MacFarlane has expressed frustration with both bans, though with differing intensities. The Partial Terms of Endearment ban he has spoken about with more evident anger, perhaps because it involved a subject about which he has clear personal convictions. The When You Wish Upon a Weinstein situation he has addressed more philosophically, as an example of the kinds of pressures that creative television faces and which are, in the end, an expected part of the landscape. The episode itself, watched now, without the surrounding controversy, in the company of the show's complete history, is actually one of the more thoughtful early-season installments. Max Weinstein is a genuinely decent human being. Peter's journey from stereotype to connection is handled with something close to care. The episode's comedy, when it works, comes from the absurdity of Peter's assumptions rather than from the assumptions themselves. And the bar mitzvah subplot, while broad, has an affection for the ritual it is depicting that keeps it from landing as mockery. It is a better episode than its reputation, earned through controversy and delay, might suggest. Number. Section 12. The Legacy of Controversy. What 25 years of pushing limits means. We have been through a lot together, working through these stories. An episode that never aired in the country that made it, sealed away because of an abortion that a fictional woman chose to have. A fan base so connected to a fictional dog that his death sent 100,000 people to the internet in a state of genuine grief. A teenager who told her family the truth about how they had treated her and was written into apologizing for it before the credits rolled. A domestic violence storyline that had all the right intentions and kept tripping over them. A joke about a marathon that became, through a combination of terrible timing and deliberate malice, something that looked like a prediction. An episode in a bank vault with no music and no cutaways, in which a talking dog revealed he kept a gun in a safety deposit box, and in which a baby told him that their friendship was the only reason the world remained worth being in. A Jesus who was lonely. A father who came out as a transgender woman and whose son loved her anyway, while the show around them couldn't quite figure out how to hold what it was doing. 3 characters in 1939 Germany, one of them running for his life, while the show tried to find the line between brave and reckless and kept walking back and forth across it. These stories, taken together, say something about what Family Guy has been across its quarter-century of existence. They say that the show was almost never simple, that even its worst failures were failures of a specific kind, failures that resulted from trying to do something that required more precision than the show could consistently muster, rather than failures that resulted from not trying at all. The show has been called a lot of things over the years. It has been called cruel, lazy, offensive, cheap, brilliant, influential, tired, alive, dead, resurrected. It has been compared to The Simpsons more times than either show deserves, and criticized in terms that presuppose a standard of care and responsibility that most entertainment never tries to meet. What the controversies in this collection share, and this is the thread that connects all of them, if you hold them up to the light at the right angle, is that they all happened because the show was doing something. They were not the controversies of a show that was simply recycling familiar material and stepping on established landmines by carelessness. They were the controversies of a show that kept walking toward things that other shows had decided not to approach. Sometimes it walked toward them well. The Bank Vault episode is as good as anything in the genre. The Road to Germany episode is disturbing and dark and alive in a way that most television comedy in the same period was not. Even Partial Terms of Endearment, the banned episode, the episode that never aired in America, is a more careful and more honest piece of work than the ban implies. Sometimes it walked toward them badly. Screams of Silence asked real questions about domestic abuse and answered them with a murder and a fade to black. Turban Cowboy made a Muslim character guilty of the thing he was suspected of and called this a story. Quagmire's dad tried to be the most sympathetic transgender portrayal on television and produced 30 seconds of vomiting. The gap between the intention and the execution, the gap that runs through almost every episode in this collection, is where the most honest version of the show's history lives. Seth MacFarlane built something with real ambitions. He wanted the show to be more than its format suggested it could be. He wanted it to go places and say things, and push against the comfortable arrangements that most entertainment makes with its audience. And for stretches of its history, particularly in those early seasons, it was exactly that. The controversies of the later seasons have a different quality. They feel less like the controversies of a show testing its limits, and more like the controversies of a show that has internalized the knowledge that controversy itself generates attention, and that has begun producing provocations with one eye on the response they will generate. The Life of Brian arc has the feel of something designed to create weeks of discussion. Turban Cowboy reads like a show that has stopped thinking carefully about what it is saying and has started thinking about what will get people talking. That shift from provoking because you believe in what you are doing to provoking because provocation has its own economic logic is the saddest part of Family Guy's long run. Not the quality decline, which is real and well documented. The sadder thing is the feeling, in the later seasons, that the show is doing the motions of ambition without the animating belief that made the early ambition worth something. But even in those later seasons, the bank vault is there. The episode where two characters sit in a sealed room and tell each other what they actually mean to each other, without a cutaway and without a joke to fall back on, and without anywhere to hide. That episode exists. The show made it, and it proves that the capacity was always there, that the writers knew what the show could be at its best, that the heart had not entirely gone out of the thing even when the machine was running on momentum more than passion. Family Guy is still on the air. As of the writing of this script, it has been renewed through its 27th season and into the 2028 to 2029 television season, which will coincide with the show's 30th anniversary. 30 years. It will have been running for 30 years. That is longer than many of the people watching it have been alive. What does that mean? It means the controversies will continue. It means the show will keep walking towards subjects that other entertainment avoids, sometimes with grace and sometimes without it, sometimes with something to say, and sometimes just to see what happens. It means there will be more episodes to add to this collection, more experiments that half work and half don't, more ambitious failures and more occasional genuine achievements, more moments when the cartoon about a dysfunctional family in a fictional Rhode Island town says something true about what it means to belong to any group of people you did not choose and cannot leave. That is what families are after all. The people you did not choose. The people whose cruelty you have somehow absorbed and whose love you somehow cannot do without. The Griffin family, at its best, was a portrait of that particular human arrangement, imperfect and sometimes ugly, and shot through with a warmth that was all the more real for being difficult. The controversies in this collection, the ones we have spent this time with, are the places where the show reached beyond what it could comfortably hold. Sometimes that reaching produced something beautiful, sometimes it produced something harmful. Almost always it produced something worth examining. And there is value in that, in sitting with the difficult things, in looking at them in the quiet, in asking what they were trying to do and whether they did it, and what the gap between those two things reveals. That is what we have been doing here, in the long night, in the space between one thought and sleep. Thank you for spending this time with me. If you made it here, to the end of all of these stories, you are the kind of person this channel was made for. If you found something that made you think, something that settled your mind, and let the evening go quiet around you, please consider subscribing and leaving a like. It takes a few seconds, and it genuinely matters more than you probably realize. Drop a comment too, I read every one of them. Tell me which of these episodes you remember most vividly, or which one surprised you, or just where you are in the world right now and what the night looks like from where you're sitting. Rest well. End of script. Number. Expanded Section 2. The band episode. Partial terms of endearment. Extended. Let us go back to that empty space at the end of Season 8, because it deserves more time than a single pass allows. The interesting thing about a banned episode, about any piece of creative work that is withheld from its intended audience, is that the withholding itself becomes part of the work's story. Partial Terms of Endearment is not just an episode of Family Guy that deals with abortion. It is an episode of Family Guy that deals with abortion, and that the United States refused to let air, and those two facts are inseparable now. The ban is part of the text. It changes how you read the episode when you finally do watch it. And many people did eventually watch it through the DVD release, through the BBC Three broadcast, through the underground channels that the internet has always provided for content that official distribution networks decline to carry. The episode did not disappear. Fox's decision to keep it off American television did not unmake it or contain it. It gave it a kind of forbidden status that, if anything, ensured that the people most interested in challenging the boundaries of broadcast television would seek it out. Seth MacFarlane's position on the ban has been consistent since it was imposed. He has said that the episode was not an advocacy piece. It was not pro-choice propaganda, as some of the discourse around it suggested. He has characterized it as a story that tried to present both sides of the debate with sincerity, and he has argued that a show capable of depicting infanticide as comedy and terrorism as a casual cutaway backdrop should not be prevented from airing an episode in which a character faces an abortion decision without melodrama, without judgment. This argument has merit. The specific inconsistency it points to the willingness of American broadcast television to air graphic violence and dark comedy, while drawing a firm line around reproductive health care as a plot element, is a real feature of the regulatory and commercial landscape that governs what can and cannot appear on network television. The FCC's indecency standards, which have evolved significantly over the decades, have never been uniformly applied. What counts as indecent has always been shaped by the particular anxieties of a particular moment in American cultural politics. In 2010, the abortion debate in the United States was, as it has always been, deeply polarized. There was no version of an abortion episode of a major broadcast show that would not generate protest from some community. The question was always which protest carried more commercial weight: the protest from pro-life organizations who would argue the episode normalized abortion, or the protest from pro-choice advocates who would argue the episode was handled irresponsibly. Fox seems to have calculated that neither protest was worth the inevitable noise, and made the preemptive decision to avoid both by simply not airing the episode. What that calculation misses, and this is the part that MacFarlane found most frustrating, based on his public statements, is the possibility that the episode itself was more thoughtful than its subject implied. That Family Guy had written something genuine. That the comedy and the sincerity were not in conflict. The episode's most technically interesting narrative feature is the way it structures Peter's arc. Peter begins the episode as the obstacle, the resistant husband who does not want Lois to become a surrogate, and who spends the first act trying, in increasingly absurd ways, to derail the process. His methods of attempted sabotage include hiring 1980s breakdancers to perform near Lois in the hope that the physical activity would trigger a miscarriage, and later attempting an elaborate Wile E. Coyote-style physical intervention that fails in the way these interventions always fail on the show. The humor is standard Family Guy, broad, physical, pushing the joke one step further than it needs to go to ensure the audience has registered the absurdity. Then Naomi and Dale die, and Peter, confronted with a situation that he has to engage with as something other than an obstacle to be removed, encounters the pro-life argument not as an abstraction, but as a group of real people with genuine conviction standing outside his house with signs. He listens to them. He is moved. The episode allows him to be genuinely moved, not satirized for being moved, not positioned as a fool for taking the argument seriously. He shifts his position from wanting Lois to abort to wanting her to carry the pregnancy to term. And Lois, who has spent the episode navigating her own complicated feelings about what she agreed to and what it now means in the absence of the people she agreed to do it for, is in exactly the opposite position. She began the episode as the one more committed to the arrangement. She ends it as the one who has to decide what she owes to a pregnancy that no longer belongs to anyone she loves. The scene in which Peter and Lois argue about this is the episode's heart, and it is remarkably fair to both of them. Peter is not a buffoon in this scene. He is a man who has genuinely changed his mind based on an argument he found compelling, and he is trying to communicate that change to his wife with something approaching sincerity, which is not a mode Peter operates in very often. Lois is not a villain. She is a woman who made a specific promise to specific people who are now gone, and who is trying to figure out what that promise means now and whether she owes it to anyone still living. The ending Lois has the abortion. Peter addresses the camera with the plain statement of fact is not a celebration or a condemnation. It is a record. This is what happened. This is the choice that was made. The show does not ask you to feel good about it or bad about it. It asks you to understand how someone arrived there. In a cultural moment when almost every piece of entertainment that touches the abortion question feels obligated to come down decisively on one side or the other, the studied neutrality of partial terms of endearment is genuinely unusual. It is unusual enough that the refusal to air it becomes, in retrospect, a kind of cultural document. Fox was not afraid of what the episode said. It was afraid of the conversation the episode would start, a conversation that, in the American media environment of 2010, was impossible to have without casualties. The episode was eventually released on DVD with additional content, including commentary from the writers. It has been available through various physical and digital channels ever since, though it has never made it to the streaming services where most Americans now watch television. The Season 8 DVD set sold without it included the set's final episode was instead something else, and Partial Terms of Endearment was packaged separately, its status as the banned episode built into its marketing. Danny Smith, who wrote the episode, has described it in interviews as one of the pieces of work he is most proud of from his time on the show. He has said the intention was always to do something that took a serious subject seriously, even inside the Family Guy framework, and that the episode's fate sealed away, seen only by those who went looking for it, is a kind of reminder that television's relationship with its own audience is always mediated by forces that have nothing to do with the quality of the work. There is also a more prosaic version of the story, which is worth acknowledging. The episode's production coincided with a period when Fox was making a series of decisions about Family Guy that reflected broader anxieties about the show's commercial health. The ratings, while still strong by the standards of animation in primetime, were not what they had been at the peak of the revival. The network was sensitive about controversy in a way that it might not have been a few years earlier or a few years later. The decision to pull the episode was a risk management decision, made by people whose primary concern was the network's relationship with advertisers and the FCC, not the creative integrity of a specific episode of a cartoon. This is not cynical, it is simply the reality of how commercial broadcasting operates. The creative team made something bold. The network decided that bold, in this instance, was too expensive. The episode went into the vault. It is still there, technically speaking, available but absent, existing but unseen by the American audience it was made for. That condition of being present and absent at the same time, of having been made without being allowed to fully exist, gives Partial Terms of Endearment a quality that almost no other episode of Family Guy has. It is a ghost story. Not the ghost of something that died, but the ghost of something that was never fully born. Number. Expanded Section 3, The Death of Brian Griffin. Extended. The fan petition that gathered over 100,000 signatures demanding Brian Griffin's return was, in its own way, a more interesting cultural artifact than the episode that inspired it. Think about what was happening in that moment. Tens of thousands of people, acting in concert, spending their time and their internet access and their genuine emotional energy to argue for the restoration of a fictional dog to a cartoon, organizing, signing, sharing. Behaving, in other words, exactly the way people behave when something real has been taken from them. And in a sense, something real had been. Brian Griffin was not simply a character on a show. He was a kind of companion, a presence that had been part of the living rooms and laptop screens and late-night viewing habits of millions of people for nearly 15 years. The specific texture of his voice, the particular rhythm of his sarcasm, the way he held his martini glass, these were things that had become part of people's sensory vocabulary of comfort. You knew Brian. His flaws were your flaws. His pretensions were ones you recognized from the mirror. The death scene itself, rewatched carefully, is technically excellent. The direction makes a series of choices that are deeply unlike the rest of the show. The camera stays close. There are no cuts for comic effect. The music does not enter to soften the scene or cue the audience about what to feel. Brian is on the pavement, and the family is around him, and the silence between their words is allowed to be silence. Peter's voice, when he speaks, is quieter than Peter's voice ever is. Seth MacFarlane, in the recording booth, made a choice that required setting aside the broad character he had been performing for over a decade and finding something smaller and more human inside it. MacFarlane is the voice of Brian. He is also the voice of Peter, and he is also the creator of the show. So what was happening in that scene was, in some sense, Seth MacFarlane performing grief for himself, voicing the character who was dying, and the character who was watching the death, and the whole narrative architecture around both of them. There is something genuinely strange about that, when you sit with it. The creator of the show was inside the scene, playing both its subject and its witness. The response from Stewie in the episode is the part that has aged most interestingly. Stewie's grief at Brian's death is not played for comedy. It is not undercut by the show's usual comic instinct to step away from feeling before the feeling gets uncomfortable. Stewie is simply, quietly devastated. He does not know what to do with the world without Brian in it. Their friendship, which had evolved over years from the antagonistic early seasons into something genuinely warm and specific, is suddenly exposed by its absence as the show's deepest emotional relationship. This is perhaps the most revealing thing about the Life of Brian controversy. The argument that Brian's character had become insufferable, that the arrogant, preachy, self-serving Brian of seasons 8 through 12 was unworthy of the audience's affection, ran directly into the reality of how people felt when he was gone. And what that collision revealed was that the love was always there. The frustration with what the character had become was a form of grief itself, a mourning for the Brian of the early seasons, the one who had been present and necessary and real. The death of the later Brian triggered grief for the earlier one. They were the same character. You could not mourn one without loving the other. The replacement dog Vinny is worth spending a few more words on than he usually gets. Tony Sirico, who voiced him, was a legendary figure from his decades of work in The Sopranos, and he brought to Vinny something that was genuinely fresh, a warmth underneath the rough exterior, a working-class emotional directness that was entirely different from Brian's intellectual posturing. Vinny did not pretend to be more than he was. He did not write novels he never finished or lecture people about politics. He was a dog with feelings, and he said the feelings plainly, and in the brief time he existed, he was actually quite likable. Some fans who were opposed to Brian's return made this argument in the aftermath of Christmas Guy, that giving Vinny time to develop and finding a different direction for the show's central dog character might have been more interesting than simply restoring the status quo. The argument has merit. The show had reached, briefly, a genuinely different place. A Vinny-centered show would have required the writers to build new dynamics, to find new emotional registers for the supporting cast, to work without the familiar shorthand they had developed around Brian's relationship with every other character. It might have been better. It might have been worse. We will never know, because the show chose not to find out. MacFarlane's tweet after the Christmas Guy episode aired, "I mean, you didn't really think we'd kill off Brian, did you?" was read by many fans as dismissive, as a retroactive minimization of the emotional investment the show had deliberately solicited. If the death was never intended to be permanent, the argument goes, then soliciting genuine grief for it was manipulative. The show used its audience's love for a character to generate engagement and then laughed at the audience for having that love. This is a fair reading. It is also not the only available reading. The other way to understand what MacFarlane was saying, the more charitable interpretation, is that the show, like its audience, understood that Brian was irreplaceable. That the experiment of removing him had demonstrated not just that people cared, but that the show itself could not function without him. That, "I mean, you didn't really think we'd kill off Brian" is not mockery of the audience, but a confession by the creator that he had tested something and discovered a limit. Brian could not be permanently killed because Brian is structurally necessary. He is the voice of reason, the interlocutor, the counterweight to Peter's chaos and Stewie's extremity. Remove him and the whole machine tilts. The show discovered this by briefly removing him and watching what happened to the center of gravity. Then it put him back. Whether that discovery justifies the method used to make it, whether the cost in audience trust and emotional goodwill was worth the lesson, is a different question. A question that does not have a clean answer. The show gained something by doing what it did. It also spent something. And in the economy of long-running television, what you spend in audience trust is currency you cannot easily rebuild. Number. Expanded Section 5 Screams of Silence. Extended. The episode's opening sequence is worth examining at length because it establishes the tonal problem that will follow the episode all the way to its end. Quagmire is found, by Peter and Joe, in a situation involving autoerotic asphyxiation. He has nearly killed himself during an unsupervised act of extreme sexual risk-taking. The show plays this for the expected comedy, the absurdity of the discovery, the social awkwardness of Peter and Joe having to explain to the hospital what they found when they arrived, Quagmire's lack of apparent embarrassment at having been discovered. This is standard Family Guy territory. The audience is laughing. The rhythm is familiar. And then Brenda arrives. The show does not ease you into the shift. It does not gradually walk you from comedy towards something heavier with a series of transitional beats. Brenda simply appears with her injuries visible, with the signs of Jeff's violence written on her face and body, and the tone of the episode cracks down the middle. What was a broad comedy about sexual misadventure has become, in the space of a scene change, something that refuses to be funny. The crack never fully heals. The episode tries, throughout its runtime, to honor both registers to be Family Guy in its approach to Quagmire's storylines while being something else in its approach to Brenda's. But these two things cannot coexist without friction. Every time the show cuts back to a Quagmire and the Guys scene and finds its footing in the familiar rhythms of the show's comedy, the return to Brenda feels like a jolt. The audience has been lulled back into the light and then yanked into the dark again, and the repeated back and forth produces a disorientation that the episode never addresses. Caitlin Olsen's performance is worth examining in detail here, because she did something with the material that the material does not entirely deserve. She found in Brenda a specificity that the script does not consistently provide. She gave the character an interior life that you could feel even in scenes where the dialogue was giving her nothing but victimhood to work with. There is a scene in which Brenda describes Jeff to the group, and you can hear, underneath the words, the complicated math that abused people do, the constant recalculation of reality that keeps someone in a situation that everyone outside it can see is dangerous. Olsen plays that math. She makes you understand, even if you cannot agree, why Brenda stays. The episode's core dramatic argument that intervention is necessary when a person cannot remove themselves from danger is a legitimate one, and it is handled with more care than the show usually extends to subjects of this gravity. Glenn's letter to Brenda, in particular, is a quietly affecting piece of writing. The moment in which MacFarlane voices it as Quagmire, a character who is, in most episodes, the show's least complicated repository of sexual boorishness and finds genuine tenderness there, is one of the more surprising achievements in the show's long catalog. But the solution the episode arrives at murder is where the legitimate argument collapses into something more problematic. The show needed an ending, and the ending it chose was the one that provided the most immediate catharsis. Jeff dies. The threat is removed. Jeff is not a person with a history and an inner life. He is a symbol of violence, and symbols can be destroyed without the moral complexity that comes with ending a human being's actual existence. Real domestic violence advocates were consistent in their criticism of this framing. The murder of an abuser, they pointed out, does not end the cycle of abuse for the person who survived it. The trauma continues. The psychological damage continues. The patterns of relationship that led someone into that situation in the first place do not dissolve because the immediate danger has been removed. What Brenda needed after Jeff was years of support, therapy, consistent human connection from people who understood what she had experienced. What the episode gave her was freedom, which is real and necessary, and then rolled the credits. The absence of Brenda from the show's subsequent seasons, until her reveal as dead in a much later episode, can be read as the show's unconscious acknowledgement of this limitation. It did not know what to do with Brenda after the episode was over. The story it wanted to tell, Escape from Abuse, was the story of a moment, not the story of what follows that moment. And so Brenda simply disappeared from the narrative, which is, in its own way, a continuation of the episode's failure to fully see her as a person rather than a story. The show did real work in Screams of Silence. It also revealed, in the trying, exactly where its structural limitations lie. It can get you to the edge of the difficult thing. It cannot always take you through it. Number. Expanded Section 7 Brian and Stewie in the Bank Vault. Extended. The decision to write an episode with no cutaways is, in the context of Family Guy, almost as radical as the decision to write an episode about abortion. The cutaway gag is not just a comedic device on this show. It is load-bearing architecture. It is what keeps the ceiling up. It provides relief from dramatic tension, fills the time between plot points, and allows the writers to include jokes that have no relationship to the episode's story, but that are funny enough to justify the detour. Remove the cutaways and you do not just change how the episode looks. You change what the episode is fundamentally capable of doing. Gary Janetti, who wrote Brian and Stewie, understood this. The choice to build the episode without cutaways was not a stylistic preference. It was a structural commitment to a specific kind of story, a story that would not allow itself to be relieved. A story that, once it started moving toward its emotional center, would not be permitted to flinch away from it. The genius of the episode's construction is the way it uses physical discomfort as an emotional preparation. The vault is sealed. Stewie's diaper needs to be addressed. Brian must, with great reluctance and greater disgust, do the only thing that can be done in the circumstances. This sequence is genuinely unpleasant to watch. It is not played for elegance or comic distance. It is messy and embarrassing, and it puts both characters through something that fundamentally changes the terms of their relationship. Because after that, they cannot perform for each other. The usual armor, Brian's world-weary cool, Stewie's imperious detachment has been dissolved by shared humiliation. They are just two beings, locked in a room, who have been stripped of the social faces they usually present to each other. This is what makes the gun so devastating when it arrives. In any other episode, a gun would be a prop. It would be there for a joke, or for a plot, or as the setup for an action sequence. In Brian and Stewie, the gun is there because Brian put it there intentionally. He put it there during a specific moment when the weight of his life felt greater than his ability to carry it, and he has not removed it because he has not reached a point where he is certain he won't need it. It is not a past tense thought. It is a present tense contingency. Stewie's reaction when he learns this is the finest piece of writing in the episode and possibly in the entire late run of the show. He does not deliver a speech about the value of life. He does not produce a philosophical argument about why existence is worth enduring. He does not tell Brian that things will get better because he cannot know that, and Stewie, for all his eccentricities, does not lie to the people he loves. What he tells Brian is this: Brian is necessary, not as an abstraction, not because life has meaning in some cosmic sense, but because Stewie specifically and personally cannot imagine the world without Brian in it. Brian is the only person among all the people Stewie has encountered, in all the situations his unusual life has placed him in, who can understand him, who can hear him, who takes seriously the experience of being Stewie, which is a genuinely strange and often lonely experience that most other characters do not have the depth or the patience to engage with. This is, when you put it plainly, a love story, not a romantic love story, though the show has always played with the ambiguity of what Stewie and Brian's relationship actually is. A love story in the older sense, the sense of two beings recognizing each other's necessity. The argument for life that Stewie makes is not philosophical, it is relational. It is, I need you here because you are the one who makes my being here bearable. The episode received the most uniformly positive critical reception of any Family Guy episode in the show's post-revival era. Critics who had been writing about the show's decline for years found in Brian and Stewie evidence that the people making the show had not forgotten what it was capable of, that the capacity for genuine emotional weight had not been spent in the years of broader, coarser, more shock-dependent comedy. Seth MacFarlane, in a DVD commentary, described the episode as one of the most challenging to make, not technically but emotionally. The show did not know how its audience would respond to 30 minutes of two characters in a single room, with no cutaways and no music and no relief from the weight of what was being discussed. It was a bet. If the audience rejected it, the experiment would stand as a noble failure. If the audience embraced it, it would be proof that the show had more range than its recent history had suggested. The audience embraced it. The episode drew strong ratings for its time slot, and is consistently cited by fans in discussions of the show's best moments. It has a specific quality that is hard to articulate, but immediately recognizable when you feel it. The quality of a piece of entertainment that was made with real attention and real care for its subject, that took something seriously enough to build a whole episode around the seriousness. What it also did, and this is the thing that makes it bittersweet when you place it in the show's larger history, is demonstrate the cost of the show's usual approach. By showing what Family Guy could be when it stripped away all the machinery and sat quietly with two characters and what they meant to each other, Brian and Stewie implicitly indicted every other episode in the show's run that had not been willing to do the same. Not because the cutaways and the broad comedy are bad, they are often very good, but because they can become a wall between the audience and the characters when they are used as a substitute for the genuine engagement that the Bank Vault episode demonstrates is possible. The episode is the show at the limit of what it can do. It is also in some ways the show admitting what it usually avoids doing. Number, expanded Section 9. Quagmire's Dad. Extended cultural context. To understand why Quagmire's Dad landed the way it did, and why MacFarlane's claim that it was sympathetic was received with such skepticism in certain communities, You have to understand the cultural context in which it aired. 2010 was a very different moment in American public discourse around transgender identity than the present. The conversation was smaller, narrower, less visible in mainstream media. There were relatively few transgender characters in film and television. The major cultural touchstones that would shift the discourse: Laverne Cox appearing on the cover of Time magazine in 2014, Caitlyn Jenner's public transition in 2015. The political and cultural shifts of the decade that followed had not yet happened. The vocabulary that now exists for discussing these issues with specificity and care was not yet in wide use. In that context, a Family Guy episode featuring a transgender character was genuinely unusual. There were almost no comparable representations to reference. And MacFarlane's belief that he was producing something sympathetic was not insincere. He had consulted with his own creative team about how to handle the material and the episode's ultimate position, that Quagmire's love for his parent should transcend his discomfort with her transition, was a progressive position by the standards of 2010 network television. The problem was not that the episode was conservative. The problem was that the tools it used to tell its story were the same tools it always used: shock, disgust, transgression, and those tools, applied to a community that was already facing profound levels of social hostility and that had very little positive representation in the media, produced an effect that MacFarlane did not intend and that a more careful creative process might have avoided. The extended vomiting sequence is the clearest example of this. The joke is structured as follows. Brian, who prides himself on his sophistication and his open-mindedness, has unknowingly been intimate with a transgender woman. Upon learning this, he experiences intense physical revulsion. The comedy is meant to come from Brian's hypocrisy, from the gap between his self-image as a progressive, tolerant person and the instinctive disgust he cannot suppress. But the joke requires the audience to find Brian's disgust funny. And finding Brian's disgust funny means, at some level, sharing in it. The laughter the episode solicits at this moment is laughter at the idea of sleeping with a transgender woman as inherently revolting, which is not a laugh that the transgender community was positioned to find benign. MacFarlane's subsequent defense of the episode, that the joke's target is Brian's hypocrisy rather than Ida's identity, is a reasonable account of the writer's intention. It is not, however, an accurate account of how jokes work on audiences that are not positioned to read them through the lens of sophisticated media criticism. Comedy communicates through the structure of its jokes, through what the setup identifies as the incongruous or unexpected element, through where the punchline lands. Brian and Stewie had a joke where Brian's vomiting was the punchline. The punchline was about what had happened to Brian. What had happened to Brian was intimacy with a transgender woman. These structural elements do not, in the experience of watching them, separate as cleanly as MacFarlane's defense suggests they should. GLAAD's AfterElton.com reviewer Brent Hardinger, writing in the immediate aftermath of the episode, offered a nuanced reading that acknowledged both the episode's genuine intentions and its failures. He gave credit for Quagmire's emotional arc, for the episode's ultimate position that a parent is still a parent regardless of transition, and for the fact that Ida was voiced with warmth and specificity by MacFarlane himself. And he identified the vomiting scene as the moment where the episode's good intentions were undone by the show's inability to resist the easy transgressive laugh. MacFarlane's response to Hardinger's critique, when it was relayed to him in subsequent interviews, was largely to stand by his work. He did not agree that the vomiting scene communicated what Hardinger said it communicated. He believed the episode's overall message was clear, and that the scene's function within the story was satirical rather than prejudicial. This disagreement, more than any other aspect of the episode's reception, illustrates something important about the limits of authorial intention as a guide to cultural meaning. What the writer means is one thing. What the work does in the world in the specific context of specific audiences who bring specific experiences to their encounter with it is another. These two things are not the same. And in the case of vulnerable communities who are already subject to real-world hostility, the gap between intention and impact is not a matter of academic interest. It has actual consequences. Family Guy's relationship with the LGBTQ community has always been complicated. The show has, across its history, been both a supporter and a satirizer of queer culture. It has pushed for social acceptance of gay characters in ways that were, for their time, genuinely progressive. It has also produced comedy that relied on the same mechanisms of othering and disgust that have historically been used to police queer identity. These two things coexist in the show's catalog because the show does not have a consistent political philosophy. It has a consistent appetite for transgression, and transgression can cut in multiple directions simultaneously. The episode's IMDb rating of 7.5 out of 10 reflects this ambivalence. It is not a terrible rating. It is the rating of an episode that many people found significant and memorable, and at least partially successful, while enough other people found it objectionable that the average was pulled down. The controversy around it was not a consensus condemnation. It was a genuine division of opinion. And that division is itself informative. It tells you something about the range of people watching the show and the range of experiences they brought to the episode. Ida Davis returned in later episodes. Her appearances were generally treated with more warmth and less spectacle than her introduction, which suggests that either the writers absorbed some of the criticism or simply found that the shock value of her initial appearance could not be replicated and that something else was needed to justify continuing her in the story. Either way, she became, over time, a more quietly dignified presence than her introduction would have suggested she could be. That gradual rehabilitation, if you want to call it that, is characteristic of the show at its best. The recognition, belated but real, that a character introduced clumsily can be treated with more care going forward, and that the relationship between a show and its audience is long enough that early mistakes can be, if not corrected, at least not compounded indefinitely. Number. Expanded section. 10 Road to Germany. Extended. The scene that IMDb reviewers return to most often in their accounts of Road to Germany is not one that anyone would typically describe as a scene in a comedy. Stewie's time machine deposits Brian and Stewie in Warsaw on the 1st of September 1939. The specific date is important. The 1st of September 1939 was the day Germany invaded Poland. It was, in most conventional historical accounts, the day the Second World War began, and for the Jewish community of Warsaw, a community that numbered roughly 375,000 people in 1939, and that would be over the following years, nearly entirely annihilated. It was the beginning of an experience that had no adequate comparison in human history. The show lands its characters in that experience not through a historical documentary's careful framing, but through the visual vocabulary of an animated comedy. And in the episode's first major scene in Warsaw, something happens that multiple reviewers described as unexpectedly affecting. Mort Goldman lands in the middle of his own family's history, specifically on the day of his grandparents' wedding, a Jewish wedding in Warsaw on the 1st of September 1939. The wedding is underway, the music is playing, there is joy in the scene, the specific kind of joy that precedes catastrophe without knowing it, and that becomes unbearable in retrospect because of what you know is coming. Stewie and Brian arrive, and the episode, for just a moment, allows the historical reality to sit in the frame without softening it into comedy. The bombing begins. The wedding is interrupted. The specific, terrible human dimension of what is happening, that these people are celebrating and are about to be inside a war, is registered without being played for laughs. The moment does not last. The episode's plot requires forward movement, and forward movement in a Family Guy episode means comedy. But the moment was there. The show looked at the thing squarely for a second and did not blink. And viewers who were watching closely, the ones who caught the date, who understood the scale of what that date represented for the people in the scene, carried something out of those frames that the rest of the episode's comedy could not entirely erase. The plot mechanics of the episode, Stewie discovering that the time machine needs uranium to get them home, the trio making their way to Berlin to find their various disguises and near captures are more conventionally Family Guy in their execution. The comedy works at the level of absurdist incongruity. Characters from a 21st century American animated comedy navigating the infrastructure of Nazi Germany, deploying the show's characteristic irreverence in a setting where irreverence is itself a political act. Mel Brooks's argument that making Hitler ridiculous is resistance underlies the episode's approach to its German characters. The Nazis in Road to Germany are not humanized or complicated. They are targets. They are the butt of jokes. Their authority is punctured by the show's casual disrespect, and the puncturing is meant to be understood as a small act of cultural defiance in the tradition of Charlie Chaplin's The Great Dictator and Brooks's own work in The Producers and History of the World Part 1. The episode is not as careful or as artistically accomplished as any of those works. It is a Family Guy episode, operating at the level of craft that a 22-episode animated series typically achieves. But it has the right instinct. It understands at some level what it is engaging with and why the engagement might matter. The Jewish character at the center of the episode is not a stereotype. He is scared and confused and out of his depth, which is exactly what a person would be, and his fear is played with sympathy rather than mockery. Mort Goldman was introduced in the first season as a recurring supporting character, a Jewish pharmacist living in the neighborhood, a friend of the Griffin family, someone who appeared in episodes as a background figure or occasional comic presence. He has, across the show's run, been the subject of jokes that drew on Jewish cultural material in ways that walked the line between affectionate and offensive, depending on the specific joke and the specific viewer. Road to Germany treats him differently from most of his appearances. It gives him interiority. It gives him a history, the history of his family on a specific day in a specific place that makes him something more than a prop for a Jewish joke. He is terrified. He is surviving. He is someone the show is genuinely invested in getting out alive. And the combination of his personal jeopardy with the enormous historical jeopardy of the setting produces something that the show's more casual uses of Jewish cultural material do not produce: genuine stakes. The episode aired on the 19th of October, 2008, and was watched by approximately 9.07 million viewers, which was a healthy number for the show at that point in its run. Critical reception was generally positive, with reviewers noting that the episode was one of the more ambitious things the show had attempted in its post-revival era. The controversy around it was real. Jewish organizations were divided, with some appreciating the effort and others objecting to the Holocaust as comedy backdrop, regardless of execution. But it was not of the scale that other episodes generated. The Road to Germany episode's legacy is that of an experiment that largely worked. Not perfectly, not in every scene, not in the way that the best intentional works about the Holocaust work, but honestly and with genuine effort, which is more than the subject receives from most of American popular entertainment. Number, Expanded, Section 11, When You Wish Upon a Weinstein, Extended. The cultural landscape around When You Wish Upon a Weinstein was shaped by a debate that has never fully resolved itself, which is the debate about whether humor that engages with ethnic stereotypes is inherently harmful, or whether its effect depends on the specific form the humor takes and the intent behind it. The episode aired in 2003, after its initial suppression by Fox, to an audience that had already heard about the ban and was curious about what had been deemed too dangerous to broadcast. This is the interesting inversion of the usual effect of censorship. Instead of preventing people from seeing something, the ban created a market for it. The episode was sought out precisely because it had been forbidden. Its forbidden status gave it an audience that it might not have reached through ordinary broadcasting. The joke at the episode's center is one that Jewish commentators have been divided about ever since. Peter Griffin's belief that Jewish people are inherently better at managing money is a stereotype. It is presented within the episode as Peter's belief rooted in his ignorance and his pop cultural half-knowledge, rather than as a fact the show is endorsing. The episode's narrative explicitly undermines the stereotype by showing that Max Weinstein is a specific person rather than a walking embodiment of cultural assumptions. But the argument against the episode is that jokes can communicate their prejudice through their structure even when the narrative frames that prejudice as the butt of the joke. If the setup requires the audience to accept, even temporarily, that Jewish financial aptitude is a real and notable quality, then the joke has already done some of the work of the stereotype, even before the narrative undercuts it. The momentary acceptance, the suspension of skepticism that comedy requires to let the joke function, is itself a form of reinforcement. This argument has been made about comedy and stereotypes in general, and it has serious proponents in the academic literature on humor and prejudice. It is not a fringe position. It is grounded in research on how jokes function cognitively and on the relationship between comedy's use of incongruity and the way that use of incongruity can reinforce the assumptions the incongruity depends on. The counter-argument, which MacFarlane and others associated with the show have made, is that satire requires engaging with the thing it is satirizing. You cannot mock a stereotype without first invoking it. The invoking is the cost of the satire. Whether that cost is worth paying depends on whether the satire does enough work to justify it, whether the mockery is sufficient to inoculate the stereotype rather than merely repeat it. In the case of When You Wish Upon a Weinstein, the episode does enough to make the argument viable. Max Weinstein is a good person. Peter's assumption is shown to be foolish. The relationship that develops between them is warm and genuine, and based on the actual qualities of a specific man, rather than on the cultural projection that brought Peter to him. These are the tools of humanizing satire, and the episode uses them. The episode also has something that many critics of Jewish representation in mainstream entertainment have said was historically absent: a Jewish character who is simply a human being. Max Weinstein does not exist in the episode as a vehicle for Jewish jokes. He exists as a person who helps another person, and who happens to be Jewish. The distinction matters. Representation in media that shows members of a group as people first, rather than as repositories of the cultural materials associated with their group, is the kind of representation that advocates for better media depictions. Consistently pushed for. Fox's decision to not air the episode initially before Cartoon Network did was, in retrospect, a decision that the network has never fully explained. The ban was shorter-lived than the partial terms of endearment situation, and the episode eventually made it to broadcast without major incident. But the initial suppression created the impression that the episode was more radical than it was, and that impression persists in the cultural memory around it. MacFarlane has a complicated relationship with this episode's legacy. It is one of the works from the early run that he is most consistently asked about, partly because of the ban and partly because it deals with subject matter that carries genuine cultural weight. His responses have evolved over the years, becoming more nuanced and more willing to engage with the complexity of what the episode was attempting, and that evolution mirrors a broader shift in how he and the show have discussed their engagement with sensitive material over the decades. The episode is, in the end, a better piece of work than its reputation as the banned Jewish episode suggests. It was attempting something real, about the difference between what people project onto groups and what they actually encounter when they meet a specific person from that group. It used comedy to explore that gap. It did not fully succeed. No half-hour television episode fully succeeds at that kind of ambition, but the attempt was genuine, and the execution was more careful than the controversy around the ban implied. What the ban ultimately did was mark the territory. It said, "This is where Family Guy begins to cross a line." And from that mark, the show spent the following decades navigating the territory on the other side, sometimes finding in it genuine insight, sometimes simply finding in it shock value that dressed itself in the language of satire. The distance between those two things, between insight and shock dressed as insight, is the central tension in the show's long engagement with controversial material, and it is a tension that was never fully resolved. Perhaps it could not be. Perhaps the only way to stay honest about the difficulty of the material was to keep bumping up against the limits of what the show could do with it, and to let the audience judge, episode by episode, which side of the line you were on. Number. Expanded Section 12. The Full Legacy. What controversy really means for a show that has run for 25 years. We have spent a considerable amount of time in this space, working through the details and the debates and the cultural contexts of all these episodes. Let us take some time now to hold them all together and ask the broader question. What does it mean that a show has been this controversial, this consistently, for this long? Part of the answer is statistical. A show that airs 20 or more episodes per year for 25 years, in a format that has always been willing to engage with sensitive material, will accumulate a significant volume of controversial moments simply as a function of volume and intent. The show was never designed to stay safe. From the very first pitch that Seth MacFarlane made to Fox in 1998, Family Guy was conceived as a show that would go places other shows would not go. The controversies were not accidents. They were, in a real sense, the product working as designed, but statistics do not fully explain it. The show's controversies are not evenly distributed across its run. They cluster in specific moments and around specific themes. The religious material, the representation of marginalized communities, the treatment of real-world tragedies, the storylines about abuse and domestic violence and reproductive rights, these are the areas where the controversies are concentrated. And that concentration tells you something about where the show was reaching most ambitiously and where it was most likely to fall short. The ambitious reach is real. it is worth honoring. Family Guy, at various points across its history, attempted things that primetime American television simply does not attempt. It put a banned episode about abortion on a DVD and let people find it. It killed and resurrected a character in a way that demonstrated the audience's genuine attachment to him. It put 3 characters, including a Jewish one, inside the Holocaust, and tried to make comedy that honored, rather than trivialized, the historical reality. It made a bottle episode about 2 animated characters' genuine emotional need for each other that contained no jokes for 30 minutes straight and asked the audience to simply sit with the feeling. These are not the actions of a show that stopped caring. They are the actions of a show that kept caring inconsistently, imperfectly, sometimes in ways that produced harm alongside the ambition, but still caring enough to keep pushing. The failure cases are equally real. The Meg storyline, across 10 seasons of sustained cruelty that the show justified to itself as commentary on family dynamics, is a genuine moral failure of the writing room. The Turban Cowboy episode is a genuine case of lazy thinking producing harmful representation. The Screams of Silence episode is a genuine case of good intentions being defeated by insufficient craft. What distinguishes the failures from the successes is not the subject matter, it is the degree of genuine engagement. The episodes that work, the Bank Vault episode, the banned abortion episode, Road to Germany at its best work because the writers took the subject seriously enough to think through what they were doing before they did it. The episodes that failed do so because the writers reached for the subject and did not think through the reach. This is, in a way, a simple principle, almost banal in its simplicity. Serious subject matter requires serious engagement. Taking something seriously enough to depict it requires taking it seriously enough to understand it. Comedy that does not understand its subject cannot critique it, it can only repeat it, dressed in laughter. Family Guy understood this principle sporadically and applied it inconsistently. The episodes collected here are the ones where the application, or the failure of application, was consequential enough to generate the kind of sustained response that controversy implies. There is a version of the show's history in which the controversies become the legacy, in which Family Guy is remembered primarily as the show that banned an abortion episode and killed its dog for ratings and made a joke about the Boston Marathon 3 weeks before a bombing, in which the harmful representations overshadow the genuine achievements. And there is another version, in which Brian and Stewie is remembered alongside the best bottle episodes in the history of American television, in which Road to Germany is remembered as one of the more thoughtful, animated engagements with the Holocaust in popular culture, in which the fact that the show made partial terms of endearment at all that it tried, seriously, to tell an honest story about abortion is remembered as evidence of creative courage rather than commercial miscalculation. Both versions are true. The show was better than its worst episodes and worse than its best ones. This is true of almost every long-running creative endeavor, and Family Guy is no exception. What makes it worth examining, what makes these episodes worth sitting with in the quiet of a long night, is that the gap between the best and the worst is unusually wide. The ceiling is genuinely high. And the gap itself, the space between what the show could do and what it often chose to do instead, is where the most honest account of its history lies. Seth MacFarlane created something in 1999 that has outlasted 2 cancellations, a writer's strike, a major character's death and resurrection, the departure of most of the original creative team, and a quarter-century of cultural change in the country it was made in and made about. That is its own kind of achievement, separate from any question of artistic merit. The show is still here. It will keep being here, through at least season 27 and probably beyond. The controversies will continue. The show will keep walking into difficult territory, sometimes with grace and sometimes without it, sometimes saying something true and sometimes simply making noise. And the audience, smaller than it was at the peak, but still present, still watching, still caring enough to argue about what the show does and does not do well, will keep showing up for it. Which is, when you think about it, its own form of tribute. You do not argue passionately about things you do not care about. The controversies exist because the audience still believes the show is capable of something better than its worst moments. That belief, stubborn, sometimes frustrated, occasionally disappointed, is what keeps the conversation alive. It is what keeps people watching at 2 a.m, in the dark, letting the stories wash over them, finding in the familiar voices something that is close enough to company to make the night feel less long. Thank you for being here for all of it. If this kind of long, unhurried storytelling is something that helps you rest and makes the quiet feel less empty, please subscribe. It genuinely matters and takes only a moment. Leave a comment below telling me which of these episodes left the biggest mark on you or which one you remember differently from how I described it. I love hearing from you. And wherever you are in the world right now, whatever time the clock shows, whatever the sky looks like outside your window, I hope the rest of your night is gentle. See you next time. Number, additional section. The Simpsons Guy crossover and the rape joke controversy. There is a particular kind of moment that occurs occasionally in television history, a moment when two cultural institutions collide and produce something that neither could have produced alone. The Family Guy and Simpsons crossover episode, which aired in September of 2014, was supposed to be one of those moments. A celebration. A summit between the two longest-running animated comedies in the history of American primetime television. An occasion for both shows to acknowledge the other's existence and to find, in the comedy of their collision, something that honored what they both were. The episode, titled The Simpsons Guy, ran for 1 hour, twice the length of a standard Family Guy installment, and its premiere was treated as a major broadcast event. The premise required the Griffin family to leave their hometown after Peter's misogynistic comic strip generated enough local outrage to make their neighborhood uninhabitable, and to end up, through a series of accidents, in Springfield. The Griffins meet the Simpsons. Hijinks ensue. An extended fight between Peter and Homer, both animated, both outsized, both deeply committed to their idiosyncratic versions of American working-class fatherhood, takes up a significant portion of the episode's runtime. Brian befriends Santa's little helper. Bart and Stewie form an uneasy alliance based on mutual recognition of their overlapping but distinct niches in the animated comedy ecosystem. The episode attracted enormous viewership. Over 8 million people watched it, a number that Family Guy had not reached since the mid-2000s, and it was generally received as what it was. A piece of fan service executed with professional competence and a genuine affection for both franchises. And then the rape joke happened. In a scene where Bart Simpson teaches Stewie Griffin the art of the prank phone call, Stewie uses the technique on Moe's Tavern. The punchline of the call involves Stewie describing someone performing a violent sexual act on a female relative. The joke is quick. It is framed as part of a broader comedic sequence about prank calls. It is, in the mechanics of the scene, a throwaway. But the Parents Television Council and several other advocacy groups identified the moment immediately and objected strenuously. Their objection was not complicated. A rape joke, delivered casually as part of a comedic sequence in a television episode that drew over 8 million viewers, including a significant number of children and teenagers, normalizes sexual violence by treating it as an appropriate punchline for casual comedy. This is an argument that has been made about rape jokes in popular culture for a long time, and it is not without serious intellectual backing. Comedy that treats sexual violence as a source of humor, even when the humor is theoretically directed at the absurdity of the situation rather than the act itself, risks desensitizing the audience to the reality of what is being joked about. The desensitization argument is contested, and the research on comedy's effects on attitudes is complicated, but the argument has enough substance to be taken seriously rather than dismissed as prudishness. Family Guy's relationship with sexual violence as comedy material is one of the darker recurring threads in the show's history. MacFarlane has been directly criticized, on multiple occasions, for the show's use of rape as a punchline. The criticism has come from both cultural critics and from within the entertainment industry, and MacFarlane's responses to it have been varied, sometimes defensive, sometimes genuinely engaging with the concern, sometimes arguing that satire requires engaging with the thing it is satirizing even when the subject is this serious. The crossover episode was a particularly visible venue for this debate because of the size of the audience. A controversial joke in a standard Family Guy episode reaches the show's regular audience, which by 2014 had declined significantly from its peak. A controversial joke in a crossover event watched by 8 million people reaches people who do not normally watch the show and who do not have the established relationship with its brand of comedy that regular viewers have developed. For those viewers, the joke existed without context, without the surrounding relationship with the material, without whatever critical distance sustained viewers might bring to it. The crossover episode, taken as a whole, is an interesting artifact of both shows' relationship with their own legacies at a specific moment in time. The Simpsons, by 2014, had been running for 26 seasons and was well past the point at which most critics would argue it was doing its best work. Family Guy had its own long history of decline and partial recovery. The crossover brought two institutions together, both of which were navigating the specific problem of being shows that had once meant something very particular to their audiences, and that were now carrying that meaning as a kind of inherited debt. The fight between Peter and Homer is the episode's centerpiece, and it is genuinely funny in the way that good escalation comedy is funny, starting from a place of real grievance and building through a series of improbable developments into something that is clearly beyond ordinary human endurance, and yet still somehow feels emotionally coherent. The two characters, physically and temperamentally similar in certain ways and radically different in others, are well matched. The sequence works. What the episode does not do, and what its hour of runtime cannot quite accomplish, is say anything interesting about why both shows exist, what they mean to the people who watch them, or what their collision reveals about the state of American animation and comedy at the point when the episode was made. The meta-commentary, the episode gestures toward jokes about the similarities and differences between the two shows' formats, references to the critical debate about which show is better, remains at the surface level. The deeper conversation, if there was one to be had, was not had. Number, additional section Family Gay, and the conversion therapy episode. The 7th season episode Family Gay aired in March of 2009 and generated a protest from the Parents Television Council that included a formal indecency complaint filed with the Federal Communications Commission. It also generated a significant positive response from LGBTQ advocacy organizations who appreciated what the episode was doing, though, characteristically for Family Guy, the appreciation was not without qualifications. The episode's premise involves Peter participating in a medical trial that injects him with the gay gene, causing him to become gay. He enters a relationship with a man named Scott. He and Scott are happy. Lois is devastated. The family processes what feels like a fundamental change to their reality, and then Peter is injected with the gene for heterosexuality, which sends him back to his previous state, and the marriage is restored. The episode's satire is directed at the idea that sexual orientation is a biological switch that can be flipped through medical intervention, which is, of course, the premise of conversion therapy, the practice of attempting to change a person's sexual orientation through psychological or medical means. Conversion therapy has been widely condemned by major medical and psychological organizations as not only ineffective but actively harmful, particularly to the young people on whom it has most frequently been practiced. By staging a scenario in which Peter's orientation is literally changed by a medical injection, the episode was making an argument about conversion therapy in the most direct way Family Guy knows how, by reducing it to absurdity. The absurdity of a gay gene that can be injected and then countered by a heterosexuality gene is the argument. The premise of conversion therapy is exactly this absurd, exactly this scientifically unfounded, exactly this oblivious to what sexual orientation actually is. The LGBTQ community's response to the episode was mixed in a familiar way. Advocacy organizations that prioritized representation found much to appreciate. Peter's relationship with Scott is portrayed with warmth and without mockery. Scott is a human being, not a stereotype. Peter's experience of being gay is portrayed as authentic, rather than as a joke at the expense of gay men. The episode's ultimate target is clearly the practice that claims to be able to reverse orientation, not the orientation itself. The PTC's objection was, as usual, from the opposite direction. The organization objected to the portrayal of a gay relationship as acceptable and warm, and to the episode's implicit argument that conversion therapy is harmful rather than legitimate. The interesting middle ground was occupied by critics from within LGBTQ communities, who appreciated the episode's satirical intent but questioned some of its specific choices. The gay gene framing, while satirical, also inadvertently reinforces a biological determinist model of sexual orientation, the idea that gayness is a genetic trait rather than a complex aspect of identity. This model has been used by some advocates of LGBTQ equality, but it has been criticized by others within the community as an oversimplification that misrepresents the diversity of human sexual experience and that could potentially be weaponized in other contexts. These are the kinds of nuanced internal debates that mainstream entertainment, when it engages with LGBTQ material, rarely has the room or the expertise to navigate. Family Guy, characteristically, did not navigate them either. The episode made the satirical argument it wanted to make and moved on, leaving the more complicated questions for others to wrestle with. The formal indecency complaint from the PTC was eventually dismissed. The FCC determined that the episode did not meet the legal standard for broadcast indecency. This was the expected outcome. Family Guy had faced numerous such complaints across its history, and the legal standard for indecency on broadcast television is considerably narrower than the PTC's preferred definition. What Family Guy illustrates, placed alongside the other controversial episodes, is the show's tendency to engage with social issues through allegory or comedic reduction rather than through direct engagement. Conversion therapy is satirized not by showing what it actually is and does to the people it is practiced on, but by staging a science fiction version of its premise and letting the absurdity of the science fiction version do the satirical work. This approach has real strengths. It allows the show to address the subject without the weight of documentary realism, to make its argument in a register that its audience is comfortable with. It also has a real limitation. The allegory can never fully convey the specific human cost of the practice it is satirizing. The young people who have actually gone through conversion therapy, who have been told, in serious medical or religious contexts, that their orientation is a disease that can be cured, do not experience their situation as science fiction absurdity. They experience it as a judgment delivered by institutions they trusted. The distance between that experience and a joke about a gay gene injection is significant, and it is the kind of distance that satire can sometimes bridge and sometimes cannot. Number. Additional section: The Parents Television Council and the Long War. No account of Family Guy's controversial history would be complete without spending time with the organization that has spent more of its institutional energy opposing the show than any other single entity, the Parents Television Council. The PTC was founded in 1995 by L. Brent Bozell III as an organization dedicated to advocating for what it described as responsible and decent content on broadcast television. From its earliest seasons, Family Guy was a primary target. The organization placed the show on its list of worst shows of the week with a regularity that began to seem almost rhythmic, and it filed formal complaints with the Federal Communications Commission about specific episodes with a persistence that few other advocacy organizations matched. The PTC's objections to Family Guy were comprehensive in a way that the show's other controversies were not. Where GLAAD had specific concerns about specific representations, and where anti-defamation organizations had specific concerns about specific depictions of their communities, the PTC objected to the show's entire orientation. It objected to the sexual content, the violence, the drug references, the religious material, the treatment of women, the treatment of children, and the general comedic frame that the PTC characterized as corrosive to family values and indecent by broadcast standards. The FCC received hundreds of formal complaints about Family Guy over the course of its run, many of them organized by the PTC or generated by the PTC's communication campaigns. The FCC reviewed these complaints and, in most cases, found that the episodes in question did not meet the legal standard for broadcast indecency. The legal standard, which has been the subject of considerable litigation and regulatory evolution, requires that material be both patently offensive by contemporary community standards and explicitly sexual or excretory in nature to qualify as indecent under the Communications Act. Family Guy's content routinely tested this standard without meeting it, largely because the show's most transgressive material tended to be comedic rather than explicit in the legally relevant sense. A joke about rape, for example, is not the same as explicit depiction of rape in terms of broadcast indecency law. A reference to drug use is not the same as explicit instruction. The show's writers were aware of these distinctions and worked within them with considerable sophistication. The PTC's campaigns against Family Guy were not, however, primarily legal in their effect. Their primary effect was commercial. By organizing campaigns that targeted advertisers, reaching out to companies that bought advertising time during Family Guy broadcasts, and arguing that their association with the show was damaging to their brand, the PTC created genuine commercial pressure. Several advertisers withdrew from the show at various points during its history as a result of these campaigns. McFarlane has been direct in his view of the PTC. He has characterized the organization as a censorship effort masquerading as advocacy, and has argued that its campaigns represent an attempt by a small, well-organized minority to impose its values on the broadcast choices of the larger population. These criticisms are not unreasonable. The PTC's membership and funding have never been large enough to constitute a majority position in American culture, but the organization has exercised outsized influence by focusing its resources on pressure campaigns rather than litigation. What the PTC's decades-long campaign against Family Guy ultimately demonstrates is the specific way in which American broadcast culture is governed. The content of primetime television is shaped not by what audiences want, which is a function of ratings, and not by what the law requires, which is a function of FCC regulation, but by what advertisers will tolerate, which is a function of organized commercial pressure from groups like the PTC. The show that appears on your screen is the result of a negotiation between these three forces, and the PTC has been an active participant in that negotiation since 1999. Family Guy has survived the negotiation. It has accommodated the commercial pressures when it had to, pulling the Turban Cowboy episode after the Boston Marathon bombing, keeping partial terms of endearment off American broadcast television, and resisted them when it could. The show's continued presence on the schedule, now approaching its fourth decade, is itself evidence that the commercial calculus has consistently favored continuation. But the PTC's pressure has not been without effect. There are things that Family Guy has not done, jokes that were written and then revised, material that was softened or removed before broadcast, because of the awareness that the PTC was watching and would respond. The show's specific transgressions, the ones that made it to air, are the transgressions that survive the commercial pressure. There is an invisible version of Family Guy, composed of the material that did not survive that pressure, that no one has ever seen. Number. Additional section. The Quahog World and what it says about American life. Before we close this long night entirely, it is worth stepping back from the specific controversies to consider what Family Guy, across all of its incarnations and all of its transgressions, has been describing. The Griffins live in a fictional town in Rhode Island. The town is a working-class suburb, not wealthy, not impoverished, occupying the middle ground where most of American life has always been lived. Peter works at a brewery. Lois stays home and occasionally pursues interests outside the house that the show never quite sustains across multiple episodes. The kids go to public school. The neighborhood is close-knit in the way that middle-class American suburbs were close-knit in the late 20th century. People knew their neighbors, sat on each other's porches, drank together at the local bar. This is the world that Family Guy was originally describing, underneath all the absurdism and the cutaways and the cartoon violence. A very ordinary American world, seen with exaggeration and irreverence, but ultimately recognizable. The early seasons of the show had an affection for this world that was one of the sources of its warmth. Peter and his friends at the Drunken Clam were a recognizable portrait of a particular kind of American male friendship. The bar-table democracy of people who had little in common, except proximity and habit and a genuine liking for each other's company. The controversies that accumulated around the show were, in many ways, the controversies of American life itself. The abortion debate, the religious tensions, the anxieties about representation of various communities, the debates about what domestic violence actually looks like and what society owes to its victims. These are not just the problems of a fictional family in a fictional Rhode Island town. They are the problems of the country. Family Guy was making comedy out of American anxieties, which is the oldest thing that American comedy has ever done, and the anxieties it was reaching for were the real ones. The show's failures were often the failures of American culture itself, the inability to hold complexity without resolving it, the preference for the cathartic ending over the honest one, the tendency to acknowledge a difficult reality and then use comedy to step back from the acknowledgement before it requires any real engagement. The reset button that Family Guy pressed at the end of so many episodes, restoring the characters to their starting positions as though the preceding 20 minutes had not changed anything, is the same reset button that American culture has pressed at the end of so many of its most difficult conversations. These are big claims to make about an animated sitcom. They are also, I think, accurate ones. The most enduring popular entertainment has always been in some sense a mirror, not a flattering one, not an aspirational one, but a mirror that shows you something about the world as it actually is. Family Guy, at its best, was that kind of mirror. At its worst, it was a funhouse mirror distorting the image until it was unrecognizable, until the distortion itself was the only thing you could see. The controversies collected here are the moments when the distortion was most extreme and the mirror was most contested. The moments when enough people looked at what the show was reflecting and said, that is not accurate, or that is harmful, or that is doing more damage than it is worth. And those moments, painful as they sometimes were also the moments when Family Guy was doing something that most entertainment never tries to do, genuinely engaging with the most difficult and contested aspects of American life. In a cartoon, in prime time, to an audience of millions. That engagement was imperfect. It was often clumsy and occasionally harmful and sometimes breathtakingly misjudged. But it was also, at its core, an act of faith in the audience's capacity to handle something real. The show believed, or at least acted as though it believed, that the people watching it could sit with complicated things without being destroyed by them. That comedy and moral seriousness were not opposites. That a cartoon could be simultaneously funny and true. Whether it succeeded in sustaining that belief across 25 years and hundreds of episodes is a question that each viewer answers for themselves, episode by episode, season by season, in the quiet of their own watching. What I can say, from having spent all this time with these specific stories, is that the effort was genuine. Even the failures were genuine failures, failures of craft and care rather than failures of intent. And in a landscape of entertainment that is mostly too careful, too managed, too aware of the commercial costs of genuine provocation, the fact that Family Guy kept failing in the direction of trying something real is not nothing. It is, in fact, quite a lot. Number. Additional section. The Meg storyline as a long-running controversy. We have spoken briefly about Meg Griffin in earlier sections, but the full scope of what the show did to this character over the course of a decade deserves its own sustained attention because it is perhaps the most extended and most internally coherent controversy in the show's entire history. Meg Griffin is the eldest child in the Griffin household. She is voiced, from the second season onward, by Mila Kunis, who has built one of the most successful careers in Hollywood, across the same years in which she has also been the voice of one of television's most consistently mistreated animated characters. The dissonance between the real person providing the voice and the character being mistreated is something that Kunis herself has spoken about publicly, noting that the catchphrase associated with Meg's dismissal became something that real people said to her, the actual woman, in real-world encounters, the fictional cruelty bleeding out into reality. In the first 3 seasons of the show, Meg was not the show's punching bag. She was something considerably more interesting, the normal one. In a family defined by absurdity, having a character whose defining quality was ordinariness was a genuine comic choice. Meg wanted to be popular. She was not. She wanted her family to notice her. They were too wrapped up in their own chaos to pay consistent attention. She was the ordinary teenager in the extraordinary household, and the comedy of her position came from how out of place ordinary felt in that context. The shift that occurred around the 4th season, when the show returned from cancellation, turned Meg from an ordinary teenager into a target. The joke stopped being about her ordinariness and started being about her unworthiness, about the idea that Meg was not merely unremarkable, but actively undeserving. That the correct response to her existence was contempt. And the show, over the following decade, built an entire architecture of cruelty around this premise. Critics have written extensively about the social messages embedded in this architecture. A character who is consistently female, who is consistently positioned as ugly and unwanted and deserving of abuse, and who is consistently denied the narrative redemption that other characters receive, communicates something to the audience about the kinds of people who deserve contempt. The fact that Meg is also the show's most narratively sympathetic character, the one whose desires are most recognizable, most human, most relatable, makes the cruelty toward her something that cuts differently from the cruelty toward other characters. The contrast with Peter's treatment is instructive. Peter does terrible things in the later seasons. He is cruel, reckless, sometimes genuinely dangerous. And the show consistently finds ways to make his behavior palatable, to frame it as comedy, to soften it with incompetence, to restore him to sympathetic status by the episode's end. Meg does nothing comparable and receives worse treatment. This asymmetry says something about the show's underlying assumptions about which characters are entitled to forgiveness and which ones are not. The gradual reduction of Meg's cruelty, which began around season 14 with the addition of more women to the writing staff, is one of the more hopeful evolutions in the show's later history. The women in the room pushed back against what had become an institutional pattern, and the show responded. Meg began to be written with competence and resilience. She fought back against bullies rather than absorbing them. She was given storylines where her qualities rather than her deficits were the subject. This improvement does not undo the decade of cruelty that preceded it. It does not erase the specific messages that 10 seasons of sustained mockery communicated to the audience. But it does demonstrate something important, that the patterns a show develops are not inevitable, and that different people in the creative room produce different outcomes. The writers who spent a decade treating Meg as a punching bag were making a choice. The writers who eventually changed that were making a different choice. Both outcomes were available all along. Number additional section. The Stewie Kills Lois arc and the Promise of Consequence. The Season 6 two-part episode Stewie Kills Lois and Lois Kills Stewie represents something unusual in the show's history, a sustained commitment to a premise that should have changed everything, followed by a retreat so complete that it left almost no trace. The premise: Stewie actually does what he has been threatening to do since the pilot. He kills Lois. She is gone. And then the episode follows what happens in the world created by that absence, what a Stewie who has finally achieved his goal looks like, and whether victory is what he imagined it would be. For 2 episodes, the show played this absolutely straight. There were no cutaways as punchlines, no comedic deflations of the dramatic stakes. The Griffin family grieved. Stewie assumed power, and the power looked exactly as he had always described it would look. The world domination plot, executed rather than merely proposed, was portrayed with a seriousness that made it feel real in a way that Stewie's machinations in the early seasons had never quite managed. And then it turned out to be a simulation. Stewie had run the scenario on his computer. None of it happened. Everything reset. The audience's reaction to this twist was, depending on which fan you asked, either a clever deconstruction of the character's arc or a fundamental betrayal of the emotional investment the 2 episodes had asked for. The twist worked as a joke. It worked less well as a narrative decision about what the character was going to be going forward. After these episodes, Stewie's evil genius persona was largely retired. The world domination plots that had defined the character for 3 seasons and continued as a significant presence through the revival years became rare, then rarer, then nearly absent. The Stewie who existed after Stewie Kills Lois was a different character, warmer, more emotionally available, more interested in his relationship with Brian than in his relationship with global power. This transformation is the central Stewie debate in the show's critical history. The argument against it is that the show discarded one of the most original character concepts in animated television, the evil genius baby, in favor of something considerably more generic. The argument for it is that characters should grow, and that a character frozen in the same comedic premise for 25 years would become stale in a way that even the best writers could not prevent. Both arguments have merit. What the simulation twist in Stewie Kills Lois and Lois Kills Stewie ultimately revealed was the show's fundamental anxiety about consequence. The 2 episodes had made the emotional and dramatic commitment that a genuinely consequential story requires. And then they had pulled back from it. Using the oldest trick in the genre, it was a dream, it was a simulation. It did not really happen to restore the status quo without any of the work that would have been required to sustain it. This is, in miniature, the story of Family Guy's relationship with itself. The show kept reaching toward the genuinely consequential and then retreating. The abortion episode that was never aired, the death that was reversed in 3 weeks, the Meg confrontation that ended in apology, the Stewie arc that was reset by a simulation. Each of these is the same story: ambition followed by retreat, the reaching out and then the pulling back. And yet the reaching out happened. That is the fact that keeps this show from being simply a record of missed opportunities. The ambitions were real. The attempts were real. The gap between attempt and achievement is where the most honest account of Family Guy lives, in the space between what it wanted to be and what it could sustain being. That gap is also, in some ways, what makes it worth spending time with. A show that always succeeded would not be as interesting to examine as a show that kept failing in particular ways. The specific shape of the failures tells you something. It tells you what was difficult, what was resisted, where the pressure was coming from, what the system that produced the show could and could not accommodate. The gap is a record of the show's time and place, embedded in its creative choices. We find, in the gap, the show that might have been. And in the show that might have been, we find reasons to care about the show that was. Number. Additional section. Brian Griffin's character arc and the slow erosion of a voice. One of the controversies that accumulated so gradually, it almost did not register as a controversy until people looked back at it the way you don't notice a room getting darker until someone turns on a light, was the slow erosion of Brian Griffin's character across the show's long run. This is worth dwelling on separately from the death and resurrection arc, because the deeper controversy around Brian was not about a single dramatic event. It was about the cumulative effect of hundreds of small writing decisions that, over many seasons, transformed the show's most grounded and humanizing character into something considerably more difficult to spend time with. In the first 2 seasons, Brian served a structural function that is genuinely rare in ensemble comedy. He was the character who cared. Not in a sentimental way. Not in a way that required him to deliver speeches about feelings, or to be the emotional anchor the audience leaned on for warmth. He cared in the dry, slightly rueful way of someone who has looked at the world honestly and found it wanting but who has not yet given up on it. His affection for the Griffin family was real. His friendship with Peter was real. His unhappy reaching after a writing career he could not quite sustain was real. These qualities, together, made Brian feel like someone you might actually know. The shift that began after the revival, the slow elevation of his liberal political views from one ingredient among many into the dominant note of his character, was the beginning of the erosion. Brian had always had opinions. The difference was that after the revival, his opinions increasingly became speeches. Scenes that might have been about character interaction became vehicles for a particular political position that Brian would articulate at length, while other characters provided the audience surrogate responses. This happens in political comedy all the time. Characters become mouthpieces. The failure is not in having a character with strong views, it is in allowing those views to crowd out everything else. Brian's failed novels, his complicated relationship with love, his genuine, if imperfect care for Stewie, these things became background to the political persona, rather than the full character that the political persona was one part of. What was lost was the sense of Brian as a person who happened to have political opinions, rather than a political position that happened to be shaped like a person. The distinction sounds abstract until you watch the early seasons back to back with the later ones, and feel the difference in the room. In the early seasons, you want to know how Brian is doing. In the later seasons, you know what he is going to say before he says it, and you watch to see how the other characters respond, rather than because you are invested in Brian himself. The specific arc by which this happened, the accumulation of episodes in which Brian's worst qualities were foregrounded and his best qualities were sidelined, is a record of a writing room losing track of the character they had inherited. Not maliciously, not through contempt for what Brian had been, but through the gradual institutional tendency of any long-running show to reduce its characters to their most legible and reproducible qualities, because legible and reproducible qualities are easier to write than the full complexity of a character who requires sustained attention to handle well. The Brian who existed at the show's best moments in the bank vault, in certain early season episodes, in the flashes of genuine care that appeared even in the later years, was always there underneath the version of the character the show settled into. The writers knew who Brian was. The machine that produced 20-plus episodes per year did not always give them the time and space to be that careful. The Quagmire speech in Season 8, in which Glenn Quagmire catalogs Brian's failures and hypocrisies directly to his face, was the show's own recognition that something had gone wrong with the character. It was the writers, through a different character's voice, saying, "We know. We see what has happened. We are naming it." What they did not do was fix it. Brian remained the version of himself that Quagmire had catalogued, episode after episode, for the seasons that followed. The naming of the problem served as a substitute for the solution. And that substitution, using self-awareness as a replacement for change, is one of the patterns that characterizes the show's relationship with its own flaws across its long history. The fans who mourned Brian when he was killed in Season 12 were mourning, among other things, the version of him who had not yet been hollowed out. They were expressing grief for the dog in the first 2 seasons, who felt like the most real person in the room. That grief was legitimate. It was grief for something the show had genuinely produced and genuinely lost. It was also, in the strange way of these things, a kind of love letter to what the show had been capable of, a reminder that the capacity was real, that it had existed, that the Bank Vault episode and the early Brian scenes were not accidents but evidence of something genuine. that when Family Guy was at its best, it was because the writers were paying attention to the specific human truth inside these specific animated people. And that truth, fragile, inconsistent, sometimes lost and sometimes recovered, is what makes the whole long, controversial, imperfect, occasionally extraordinary run of this show worth spending time with. Even now, even in the quiet, even at whatever hour this finds you. A note for the journey home. If you've made it to the very end of all of these stories, all the banned episodes and the online petitions and the advocacy organization letters and the 30 seconds of vomiting and the locked bank vault and the Meg who apologized when she should not have had to, then you are the reason this channel exists. You stayed, you listened, you let the night be long enough to hold all of it. Subscribe if you haven't, leave a comment. Tell me what you think, tell me where you are in the world right now, tell me what time it is. The community that forms in the comment section of videos like this one is genuinely one of the most thoughtful and warm I've encountered in this corner of the internet, and I am grateful for every person in it. Rest now. The stories will still be here tomorrow. Number A. Final note on the show's enduring place in the culture. There is a reason that Family Guy, despite everything the declining ratings, the critical consensus that the best days are behind it, the displacement from its Sunday night home, the creator's own complicated feelings about continuing is still being renewed and still being watched by hundreds of thousands of people every week. The reason is not inertia, although inertia is part of it. The reason is not brand recognition alone, although that is part of it too. The reason, at its core, is that the show has always been doing something that people needed it to do, processing the anxieties and frustrations and absurdities of American domestic life through a format that keeps the emotional cost manageable. Comedy has always served this function. The specific form that comedy takes in any given era reflects the specific anxieties of that era. What made Family Guy's form right for its moment? The late 1990s, the early 2000s, the first years of the internet age, was the particular combination of warmth and distance it offered. You cared about the Griffins enough to laugh at their failures. You were protected by the cartoon frame enough to laugh at things that would have been unbearable in a more realistic format. The form and the feeling worked together. The controversies that accumulated across the show's history are the record of the places where that combination warmth and distance, care and cruelty, ambition and retreat was most unstable. They are the fault lines. And fault lines, in geology and in culture, are where the most interesting things happen. They are where the forces that otherwise run underground come to the surface, where you can see the shape of the pressures that are always present but usually hidden. This show, with all its failures and all its genuine achievements, has been pressing on fault lines for 25 years. The earthquakes it has caused have been mostly small. Some of them have done real damage. A few of them have opened up something worth seeing. And through all of it, the machine has kept running, the Griffins have kept arguing, and the audience has kept watching. That, at the end of the very long night, is the story.